Hello everyone, welcome back into another stream of Last Protagonist reacting to a bunch of lore videos. Hope you're doing well. So yesterday we checked out the new trailer for the Elden Ring Tarnished Edition that's going to be releasing on the Switch 2. We looked at like the fake Lucatiel of Mirage set and all that stuff. Then we checked out the brand new FromSoft IP titled The Duskbloods, which is being co-developed or not co-published with Nintendo, which is definitely out of left field. Then we checked out The Alchemist, how the Erdtree stole the power of the sun and destroyed its realm. The Sun Realm Part 1. And finished off with Part 2 called The Glowmide Queen Was Here All Along, Elden Ring Lore Theory, also by The Alchemist. Then following that up, we checked out Zafe the Scholar's America's strange new connections to the Glowmide Queen, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree Lore Theory and Speculation. So for today, the first video I have queued up is Ashra's The Psychology of Powerlessness in Elden Ring and the Souls Genre. So this one just seems kind of interesting to me. I don't know what to expect beyond what we have in the title, so looking forward to that one. Then these two videos have been recommended to me for the past couple months, with The Grand Unified Theory of Elden Ring, Runes and Demigods, Part 1 by Silent Ellipsis, and then Part 2's The Grand Unified Theory of Elden Ring, Sacred Geometry. So I don't know what to expect from these two. I don't believe we've watched anything from Silent Ellipsis before, so hopefully they don't disappoint. So anyway, welcome back in, everybody. We have Weddy, Florgeborge, Elden Enthusiast, Scowleasy, Jay Rizzle. How you guys doing? You hope there'll be a free update for the armors for, the Switch version of Elden Ring? I hope so as well. Okay, so with all that said, let's go ahead and check out Ashra's The Psychology of Powerlessness in Elden Ring and the Souls Genre.
Ever played a From Software game like Dark Souls, Sekiro, Bloodborne, or Elden Ring, you would know that a lot of psychological themes are present in them. Hope, despair, tenacity, madness. But today I want to talk about one in particular, powerlessness. When we think of the Souls genre, the first thing that will come to most people's mind is, "You died." The famous catchphrase that acts as a slogan to either scare away the lesser-willed or invite those who seek a challenge. Dying is a major overarching theme in all of the Souls games, not only from a gameplay perspective, but a narrative one as well. In Dark Souls, the Curse of the Dark Sign prevents those branded from death. In Sekiro, the power of the Dragon Heritage allows rebirth. And in Elden Ring, the Guidance of Grace ushers the Tarnished toward their purpose. The creative visionary behind the Souls games, Hidetaka Miyazaki, has stated on multiple occasions that the themes of death and difficulty were intentionally designed to give players a very specific feeling, one of satisfaction. Quote, "I think death is a crucial element when designing games around the theme of the satisfaction of overcoming overwhelming odds. If you had a game that said, 'Oops, you're dead, now switch off the game,' it wouldn't be very successful, so you need to have something to teach and be there to learn from, and we feel that death in video games is a positive experience."
It's kind of ironic because that's sort of what the term game over essentially harkens back to. Because the game is over when you died in the arcade coin-op business, so switch off the game. It didn't quite go that far, but it's like, hey, pay more money if you want to play again. But so it looks like Miyazaki's factually wrong according to history. But obviously we've long since gone past the arcade coin-operated systems, and now we willingly give our money to gacha waifus, apparently. So, rip. And I do have more to say about like the whole nature of death and how that goes into the game design of things. So, I don't want to step on his toes right here.
To learn from, and we feel that death in video games is a positive experience. The last sentence is one that has stood out to me because it goes against what we would intuitively or heuristically assume about video game design. When a player experiences death or frustration, they are less likely to enjoy their overall experience, or so we tend to think. The idea of difficulty being a deterrent is something that is widely accepted and even designed around in AAA video game development. I'd like to give a summary of a relatively substantial section of a game theorist video from 2019. I'll include a link to that video down in the description box below. Games like BioShock and Assassin's Creed intentionally make it so that your last point of health is worth more than all of the others before, allowing you to survive just one more hit, or to make an epic comeback, putting you on...
So if you guys have played those games, could you describe how that works? Because the only kind of comparison point that I can think of is Sonic and his rings, and the last ring effectively makes him immortal. All the other rings disappear except for like the last 3, and then you can pretty much just like never die if you're careful about it. What he says, sometimes the game acts inconsistently. Yes, we can revive, and sometimes everyone acts like we're always in genuine danger. I think there are times and places for it. I think there's probably counterexamples to this. I'll probably be putting my foot in my mouth for saying it, but generally, I do think the FromSoft games do a pretty good job of trying to emphasize that, yeah, you can die and kind of come back sometimes, and so there is a kind of present danger no matter what you're doing, but other times it does take your revives as being more diegetic, and then other times it seems as though the story's under the belief that the protagonist has never died. It wasn't like that in Bioshock 2. Okay, I just don't know. Okay.
On the edge, giving you the position of being the underdog. Games like Crash Bandicoot introduce what's called dynamic difficulty, or difficulty that changes behind the scenes the more you lose, such as giving you an extra life or slowing enemies down. This makes sense.
Wait, was that in the first Crash Bandicoot? Because I didn't know that. That doesn't sound right. I could kind of see an element of dynamic difficulty with the way, like, the boxes and stuff work. Yeah, I guess I just don't know.
In a large amount of the best-selling games worldwide, you are the hero, you have the power, and you are the chosen one. In Skyrim, you are the Dragonborn. In Halo, you are Master Chief. And in Devil May Cry, you are the half-demon spawn of a legendary demon who is so powerful you can take a sword through your chest and be fine with it.
Yeah, Scally said some racing games have things which are similar. Mario Kart is a perfect example of that, where you'll get quote-unquote more useful upgrades the further you are behind. And obviously, if you're in first place, you will never get a blue shell, but you will get blue shelled. Hey, Chadwick, nice to see you again.
This feeling of power is satisfying. It is especially fun because this is a level of control that is not often experienced in day-to-day life. Most people aren't legendary heroes whose decisions will impact the entire world over. Most people don't even get to pick their work schedule. There is a reason these styles of games are referred to as power fantasies. They exist to give us an experience that is far beyond reality, and there is nothing wrong with that. Obviously, there is a reason they tend to sell so incredibly well. Here's where we start to talk about Elden Ring and the Souls genre, though. What happens if you take that power away? What happens if instead of the demon with a sword in his chest casually walking around, you are now the minion that just tried to stab him? Essentially, you have the opposite of a power fantasy. You are no longer starting out as the pinnacle of strength, but are instead an insignificant pawn in the grand scheme of the universe.
I'm pretty sure, like, Nice has some games like that, where you start off as, like, the weakest character. Wait, there are Prinny games, I think, in the Disgaea universe. Anyway, that's kind of irrelevant, but that's just what my mind jumped to on that topic.
Most psychological analyses of the Souls games would likely attribute this to difficulty, and they wouldn't be wrong, but I believe that the specific psychological theme of powerlessness has a special place in this conversation. You see, powerlessness can be utilized from a game design and thematic perspective in a meaningful way, but the line between complete powerlessness and godlike ability is quite hard to ride. So how do the Souls games do it? Essentially, it's potential. In the Souls genre, you start out as a nobody, even if you have a starting class, and that you really are just some guy or girl who kind of woke up one day to find themselves in a dying world. You are not some destined hero or chosen one. The landscape is full of things bigger and badder than you. Bigger is actually a very specific point here. Have you noticed in the Souls games how many bosses and enemies tower over you? In the original Dark Souls, there are 22 bosses, and only 3 of them are vaguely the size of a human. Gwendolyn, Pinwheel, and of course Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, all of which are still technically bigger than you. Elden Ring, due to its sheer number of bosses, has a few more that are somewhat in the realm of human-sized, but overall, most major bosses are much larger than the player character. The Tree Sentinel, Margit...
Trying to think of any bosses that are smaller than the character, the only one which comes to mind, and there might be like another, would be frickin' Yoda in Shadow of the Erd Tree. And if you're wielding like a great sword, you could just kind of keep him permanently stagger locked with like jump attacks if you do it right. Hey, Global, nice to see you again. You said Yoda as well, yeah. I can't think of any others off the top of my head because we don't fight any like pygmy dudes. Technically, like the Mimic tier is equivalent in size. Kyle, welcome into the stream. How you doing? you're responding to the video and you say, you don't know, Torrent chooses us. Seems like we have a destiny. You don't care if we were nameless before. We can just come and mess up an entire land and many demigods like it's nothing. We were special. I've always liked the idea that our specialness is kind of like a Groundhog Day-esque repeat of the same day over and over until that way you can just kind of repeatedly whittle down a boss and like learn its moves. And it just kind of slowly gets overwhelmed. I think like a death battle had something like that with the Dark Souls character. Maybe it was against Link. I don't remember. The fire giant is smaller than us? That's true, Forgeborge. All right, here we go.
Godric, all bosses in the very first zone and likely the first
The Lamenter. That one might actually be smaller. You're right there. That's also a gimmick fight, but he is a little bit smaller. I'll back it up.
Human-sized, but overall, most major bosses are much larger than the player character.
Oh yeah, so the point that I wanted to make with the smaller one, I think some of it is just legibility and visibility of the enemy's attacks, and that isn't just unique to the Souls games. This is a bit of an unfair example, but I'll point to Kazan. Like, all of the enemies are bigger than Kazan, essentially, and when they're not, it's really hard to see what they do, and that adds like a different level of difficulty that doesn't feel particularly fun. But the Kazan line is kind of a joke at this point, and you could make the same arguments about having bigger enemies in games like Mario. Sure, there are Goombas and the Koopa Troopas are smaller, but as far as like the bosses go, even like the Koopalings tend to be about the same size or even technically a little bit bigger than Mario's sprites. Hey, Zafe, nice to see you again. We watched your Gek video last night. Your comic got blocked? The way I described my interpretation of the Tarnish reminded you of the manga? All you need is blocked word? Oh, I have not read the manga. And then Corvinus, yes, this is Fortnite. This is the knight in the background, and she is the fort. Of course, Chadwick's headcanon for his character in Elden Ring or the FromSoft games is related to 40k. Oh, it's an Edge of Tomorrow. Okay.
The Tree Sentinel, Margit, Godric, all bosses in the very first...
Wait, what? The Tom Cruise movie was based off of... What? I did not know that. Oh, wow. Can we get a Fortnite lore video? Very unlikely, because I know next to nothing about Fortnite other than it had Jan Wick plus Peter Griffin, aka Family Guy, and apparently Goku. And you used to be able to build things, and that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge, other than it being a battle royale.
First zone, and likely the first ones you will encounter, all of which are 2 to 3 times your size. This is, in my opinion, a very deliberate choice from a game design perspective. The reason the Tree Sentinel stands right outside of the tutorial is because Elden Ring wants to very quickly teach you that the 15-foot tall horseman in golden armor will happily crush you into the ground unless you are experienced. If you didn't assume that as a player, you are likely to find it out firsthand. This instills in the player immediately that the world is dangerous, that this is not a hack-and-slash power fantasy where you can press one button and stunlock the enemy until they die. The message is clear. As of right now, you have no power. A sentiment clearly displayed by the very first NPC that you come into contact with.
Guidance, without the strength of runes, and without an invitation to the round table hold, you are fated, it seems, to die in obscurity.
So, you go out, you explore a little, you gain the ability to level up and maybe upgrade gear, you clear a minor boss or two, and in the back of your mind you think, one day I will return to this Tree Sentinel and show him who's boss. The fact that most players are forced to bypass the first major enemy they see gives the player an immediate goal to work towards, a reason to push themselves closer to their potential. After quite a few hours of gameplay, you come back for the rematch and you get the satisfaction of taking him down. You started out powerless, but now you aren't. Well, until you meet Margit.
Foul tarnished. In search of the Elden Ring. Emboldened by by the flame of ambition.
Bro, I'm gonna be so damn disappointed when it turns out that the Flame of Ambition is canonically related to Dark Souls with the inclusion of the mirror asset.
From a gameplay, lore, and literal perspective, Margit exists as a gatekeeper. He is meant to show you the extent of your powerlessness, but also to praise you very subtly for making it to him. You have ambition, and it is what got you to where you are. He essentially tells you, your willpower has brought you here, you think you have power. Allow me to show you how little power you have. The average newcomer to Souls games is likely to see Margit as a major roadblock, and this is very intentional. This is where the idea of potential comes into play. Power and potential are two very related concepts, but they are actually not the same. You see, in Souls games, you start off at the first percentile of power. You are weak, fragile, and can do little to damage enemies or protect yourself. But a lack of power does not inherently mean a lack of potential for power. World-class athletes didn't start out breaking records, and your level 1 character doesn't start out as a godslayer. Well, unless you've beaten the game a ton and can do a level 1 run. Your character has the ability to level up, strengthen themselves, acquire new gear, and become stronger. Just like you, as a player, have the ability to increase your knowledge of the bosses, become more skillful, and understand the game better. One way to visualize it is like this. Imagine that in Skyrim you start at the 80th percentile for power and you can work your way up. As the Dragonborn, a legendary hero, you are already destined for greatness even if you haven't reached your full potential. You have powers and abilities that are completely unique to you. There really isn't a skill curve or a vast amount of knowledge needed to beat the strongest of foes. In Souls games, it's the opposite. You start at the bottom, and enemies and bosses can do a bunch of awesome stuff that you can't. That said, while maybe you can't do everything they can do, you can do something they can't. Get stronger. You can make it to the top all the same, it will just require more effort and thought.
I would also accept getting good as a separate metric.
This effort is what turns a lot of people away from the Souls genre. Why should I waste my time trying to overcome a challenge that is so clearly designed to not be in my favor? Well, in the same vein, why should a student struggle through a degree or a certification to get a job they want? Why should a recovering alcoholic struggle through the pain of withdrawals and temptations? Why should someone suffering from depression struggle through negative thoughts about themselves and others? The answer is, well, because the light at the end of the tunnel is worth it. And sometimes, counterintuitively, a challenge is what is needed to give someone a light. A similar video to this one by...
I feel like those are more arguments of convenience, and it certainly doesn't work out for everybody, so...
A YouTuber I respect, Daryl Talks Games, covered the topic of how Souls games save you. Now, there have been numerous individuals who have reported that Souls...
You know, I don't think I've ever watched any of these videos. Maybe I watched one of them on stream once. They always just feel a little bit too sappy for me, and my cold, jaded heart just kind of... What's the word? Scoffs at the idea of watching them a little bit. That's not the right word. Oh well.
Souls games in particular have given them a semblance of control over their own life. I will link to his video in the description box below, and I encourage you highly to watch that video if you haven't already. One concept that I want to discuss that wasn't discussed in that video, though, is resilience. Let's take a look at an American Psychological Association definition for resilience. Psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. The last sentence is what I think Miyazaki is attempting to give players with the Souls genre of games. You see, difficulty, when it is tailored in such a way that it is not meant to completely overwhelm or frustrate you with no chance of ever succeeding, can make you a stronger-willed person who is willing to face even more adversity. It can show you that even though you might not have power, you do have potential. This idea of a specific level of difficulty being beneficial for growth is supported from a few different psychological theories. First is the theory of evolution of fair play, which shows...
So yeah, he keeps bringing it back to power, and I think saying it's the psychology of powerlessness and referring to powerlessness is implying something that he doesn't necessarily mean. Because to be powerless kind of implies in a way that you don't even have potential. But it doesn't have to do that. So I feel like there should be a better word at play here, but I'm struggling to think of what it is right now. Family drama equals FromSoft lore. Have you ever seen that the Thai Elden Ring trailer? talk about family drama. Weakness? The psychology of weakness. That would work, probably, yeah. Perhaps.
Shows that when two rats are playing with one another and one has a clear advantage, usually the larger rat, if the one with a clear advantage does not allow the other one to win at least sometimes, roughly 30% of the time, the losing rat won't want to play or interact anymore. This is something that I believe that Miyazaki understood well. To quote him once again, "To be fulfilled, you must have a goal that needs fulfilling. At the same time, it must actually be possible to fulfill said goal." This is why after a few deaths to a boss to learn its attacks, you still feel okay, but after death 10, you may decide it's time to go level up for a bit and come back later, or if you lose too much, you might even quit for the day. Or why if you are playing a game like Street Fighter with a friend and you stomp them 10 times in a row, it isn't likely for them to want to keep on playing with you. In these situations, you are experiencing powerlessness. You haven't yet utilized your potential, or the challenge is currently too far outside of your character or skill level, so the act of engaging in the activity isn't mentally worth it. Our brains are relatively good at deciding if an activity is worth it, treating time and energy as a resource. So if we face a challenge that is too oppositional, we won't want to engage in it even if we could theoretically grow from it in the long run. Another psychological theory that supports this idea is the zone of proximal development, which proposes that the perfect level of learning exists between the space of, "I can easily do this on my own," and "I couldn't do this even with help." If you crush a boss on your first attempt, you aren't likely to feel any real accomplishment. It might feel nice to win, but it won't likely feel like you overcame a true challenge, like you grew from the experience. On the other hand, if
Yeah, I can attest to that because when I was first playing through Dark Souls 1, I was like, man, if I ever beat a boss on the first try, that'll be when I know I've gotten really good. And then I got to Quelaag and I beat her on my first try, and I was actually disappointed at it somehow. And I was like, what? Because I was expecting to at least have a couple tries to get good, but one-shotting her didn't feel as rewarding as I was hoping, and I didn't really actually feel all that good. Just kind of almost felt like a fluke, or that the boss was too weak. Like the whole invincible line with, "I thought you were stronger." So, yeah.
If you lose to a boss 20 times, you are more likely to feel completely powerless in the situation, like it is out of your control to win, and thus you can't grow from that direct experience. Let's look at fighting games once again as an example. The reason these games have ranking systems is because as you rank up, you will, hopefully at least, be placed against opponents within a few tiers of skill or rank as you. Within this space of one up or one down is where an individual is most likely to experience growth. Not too easy, not too hard. The goal of the Souls experience is to put you in that middle zone where you have all of the tools available to you to win, but you are still fighting an uphill battle, fighting one zone up, where the odds are stacked against you, but not in such a way that the obstacle is insurmountable. Winning while in that center zone, the zone of proximal development, is what leads not only to a true sense of gratification, but also what is more likely to make the skills that you acquired along the way last in your mind. Quoting Miyazaki once again, "Overcoming challenges by learning something in a game is a very rewarding feeling," and that's what I wanted to prioritize in Dark Souls. This is separate from how most other game designers design difficulty, in that they aim to put you in the zone of proximal development as well, but they typically want you to be fighting one zone down. You are still learning, but it is overall easier. You might experience the occasional challenge, but a lot of your playtime will be relatively easy. The Dragonborn and Dante aren't invincible, but they are way stronger than anything in their surroundings.
We're the same. You and...
This leads to a different trajectory of growth. When most enemies are simply fodder that you can cut through with ease, the only real growth comes from boss encounters or elite enemies. These games go from "you are significantly stronger" to "you are slightly stronger, maybe even." The most difficult enemies are essentially being brought up to your skill level or power level compared to the other enemies in the game. In the Souls genre though, the curve instead goes from "you are slightly weaker, maybe even" to "you are significantly weaker," moving in the other direction, when you are encountering strong enemies or bosses. This curve, instead of asking you to pay attention for once and finally engage in a challenge, asks you to go from what was already a bit of a challenge to something that is likely to be beyond your current abilities.
It's a little bit ironic that he used the Sakura Dragon for that, because Sakura Dragon is probably one of the easiest bosses in that game. I was about to say the easiest, but I don't remember if it really is the easiest or not. Anyway, Davin Sosa, nice to see you again. It's been a minute.
Essentially, it encourages you to grow from powerlessness and push yourself to a potential that it genuinely believes that you can achieve. This is further reinforced as the philosophy of design when we see that the Souls genre is unwavering in its difficulty. There are no options or sliders in the menus. Every player must experience the same struggles, even if they overcome them in their own unique way. Quoting Miyazaki again, "We don't want to include a difficulty selection because we want to bring everyone to the same level of discussion and the same level of enjoyment, so we want everyone to first face that challenge and to overcome it in some way that suits them as a player." Powerlessness isn't always good though, and for an individual to grow from it, it must be balanced in such a way that there is actually a chance at victory. Your growth as a player needs to be able to affect the outcome in a way that extends beyond chance. To give an example of cheap difficulty versus more tailored difficulty, let's look at a game called I Want to Be the Guy. This is a
Oh, wow. I wasn't expecting that reference to come up. So, with him saying there is no difficulty in the FromSoft games, I dare him to say that, well, showing footage of him saying Dark Souls 1 is easy and wielding something like the Black Knight Halberd or something like that. Use any weapon that somebody doesn't like and they'll tell you that you're playing on easy mode.
platforming game in which the entire game is built around you losing repeatedly to tricks that are unfair until you eventually memorize all of the correct steps to take. There is no leveling your character or developing your potential or skill as a player. You are simply losing over and over until a point where you have memorized the tricks. This isn't challenge in the same way Souls games present them. It is instead intended fundamentally from the ground up to be insurmountable without prior knowledge, while a Souls game is designed to be challenging but ultimately conquerable. Another representation of bad powerlessness is when difficulty isn't designed into the game mechanically and instead numerically. To use Skyrim as an example, if you go into the settings and turn the difficulty all the way up to max, it doesn't make the enemies inherently harder or increase the abilities of their AI, it just gives them bigger damage and health values. This form of difficulty isn't asking you to grow as a player, it is asking you to grow as a character, numerically in the form of your damage and health. I am not the first to discuss this, as many have before me, but a common phrase shared throughout the Souls games is "don't you dare go hollow," which is in reference to the fact that in the Dark Souls universe, a fully hollow human is not one who has fallen from grace or failed, but one who has given up. The philosophy of powerlessness in the Souls genre isn't designed to beat you down to a point where you feel forced into going hollow, into giving up. It's not about difficulty, and it never was. It is instead to present you with a level of adversity that is just out of your comfort range, to encourage you to develop resilience and achieve your potential, to realize that you do have a say even if you are currently at a point in your life where you feel like you don't. Overall, the main point of this analysis is that powerlessness can be a good thing in game design if you are intentional with its implementation, and that experiencing powerlessness in a controlled environment can actually be psychologically healthy by giving you a safe place to develop resilience. There is a reason that people tend to vote for the underdog. There is an immense sense of satisfaction in overcoming the odds and realizing you can do something no one, maybe even yourself, thought you could do.
Yeah, I feel like using powerlessness to describe that phenomenon is just really a poor choice of word. So, like Zafe was saying earlier, I think weakness would be a better word to fit in there, because if you're powerless, it implies that you do not have the power to overcome the challenge, and yeah, I just don't think this works super well, even though I know what he's trying to say, and I do have more to discuss, but we only have a tiny bit of the video left, so let's press on.
If there's anything that I think Miyazaki wanted people to take away from his games, it's that these philosophies don't just apply to the games themselves. Adversity, challenge, and powerlessness will be present in everyone's life at some point, and it's okay to feel beaten down by them at times, but it's what we decide to do in the face of these feelings that truly matter. Life may try to teach us that we are powerless, but we have the potential to achieve our dreams. So go out there and achieve your victory, defeat your foes, and slay the gods. Thanks for watching.
I see he's a Nietzsche fan. Anyway, okay. So there's a couple of things that I want to touch on in relation to the FromSoft games that kind of only stood out to me a bit more after playing a couple other Souls-likes and some demos for Souls-likes. So for those who may have missed it, I recently reviewed the demo for AI Limit on my channel a week or two back, something like that. And it's a Souls-like, it's a functional Souls-like. It's not particularly great, it's not particularly bad. It just felt a little bit bland, and I was wondering why that was. To me, it felt kind of more similar to the pacing or the gameplay mechanics of Demon Souls or Dark Souls 1, but with notably less of the jank. And granted, it was only the demo, so I probably didn't get to experience all the game had to offer, but in the demo, there was like an advanced mode that allowed you to fight like a boss. I don't know if it's like a mid-game boss or a late-game boss. It was decently challenging enough. I beat it like within 8 tries after, screwing around and dying a couple times trying to get acclimated to different weapons and whatnot. But so really it was like 6 tries for me to kill that boss. I was like, oh, this is all right. But something felt off about AI limits and the way that it was presenting its world to me, even though it was so similar to Dark Souls in many ways, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. And then I remembered that the psychology that I think the Dark Souls games exposes to the players is one of gradually introduced hardship and overcoming such hardships, whereas AI Limit didn't really have that. So, for example, when you wake up in the Undead Asylum in Dark Souls 1, you have like the little hollow dudes that you can kind of fight, but not really at first. And then you go and face the Asylum Demon, and you either get bludgeoned into oblivion, or for some reason you picked up the bombs and kill it the first try. But most likely people are going to have to learn to run away and then go through the door and then come back and defeat the guy later. And Dark Souls 2 doesn't really have that, but it does have the annoying firekeepers laughing at your face and saying you're going to die over and over, which I absolutely despise. And then Dark Souls 3 has Udex Gundyr show up, which is probably a pretty big wall boss for a brand new player. And then Elden Ring also has a kind of Udex Gundyr moment with the Grafted Scion, except you're kind of designed to lose. And even if you beat the Grafted Scion, you are forced to fall off a cliff and die and lose everything to begin with anyway, which is honestly really frustrating to me, because like, what the hell is the point of picking a class that has a higher rune starting count? Because you're not going to get those runes again later unless you go on a no death run to go back to the precipice of anticipation. So anyway, my point is, even at the very beginning of the games, Sekiro has it too with Genichiro either losing and cutting off your arm or beating you and cutting off your arm. So my point is, the games manage the player's expectations that you're not intended to necessarily win on the very first try that you go through something. And if you want to play the game, you need to kind of get acclimated to death and dying and retrying. And so that, I think, is a really big part of the thematics of the games, and the whole struggle, the will to survive, the will to overcome, I think is a really huge theme throughout the games. And I think Bloodborne probably brings that up the best with the whole Blood Echoes, but that doesn't come across as strongly in English, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it's still there nonetheless. So, yeah, that ties into powerlessness in a way, but I wouldn't call it true powerlessness. We're led to our death by Miquella's butterflies. Exactly. Chadwick, you think all the FromSoft games have built-in difficulty sliders, leveling, numerical upgrades versus skill upgrades? I agree on that point as well. Hey, Galaxy Dragon, nice to see you again. You feel like this is a deep take on something simple? Overcoming challenge is fun and keeps people playing. To a degree. Oh yeah, and then that brings me up to the next point. When the enemies are too weak, a game can become boring and can cause people to turn off of it. So one example which stands out to me, and this is a little bit of a niche example here, is when I was trying to play Tree of Savior a bunch of years back. Tree of Savior is like the spiritual successor to Ragnarok Online. It's a gorgeous game which has awful systems and an awful, horribly translated story. Maybe they fixed it eventually. I doubt it, because it was all like fan done anyway. So when I was playing Tree of Savior, when I first logged in, they gave me like a bunch of loot boxes, which gave me like godly tier weapons as like catch-up mechanics. But I had no idea what the hell like I was doing. And so the character that I was playing was just kind of absolutely destroying everything on the screen before it could even like do anything. For levels upon levels upon levels upon levels at a time. I got to like level 80. And then like I was excited, like, oh man, I can't wait till I get further in the game and things become like more difficult. And then I was like, wait a second. I just want to get to the end game to do the exact same thing I'm doing now, just deleting screens of monsters by walking forward and shooting behind me. And this is essentially the quote-unquote end game experience that I'm chasing, but I already have it here at like level 80. And there's like over 200 levels in that game, just to give a little bit of a reference point for that. So I dropped playing Tree of Savior because there was no challenge. I didn't really feel any sense of progression. The story wasn't great. There's like a couple Easter eggs and like exploring maps, but it just kind of felt a little bit tedious. And there's been a bunch of other games where they just didn't really interest me for an extended period of time because they may have been too easy, but that's one that stands out to me. Forge says Ong Ball is living proof we all just have skill issues. So I don't have a skill issue, I just have a patience issue. Don't have the patience to get that good. Alright, so. Okay. This was a pretty interesting video. I'm not gonna like it though. It was okay. Calling it powerlessness just irks me too much. But nonetheless, I'm going to share it with you guys in the chat if you want to give Asha some support, which I did not do. So anyway, let's go ahead and transition into silent ellipses to videos. The first one being the Grand Unified Theory of Elden Ring, Runes, and Demigods, Part 1. And then Mao, welcome back in.
When I first started playing Elden Ring, I thought of it as Dark Souls, Breath of the Wild. Souls were now called runes, bonfires were sites of grace, but it was ultimately just a fancy next-gen update with a bunch of arbitrary terminology and surreal imagery.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's be real, guys. Sites of grace are and always have been lanterns, not bonfires.
Nothing embodied the surreal imagery better than the two fingers, which were originally told our sage advisors speaking on behalf of the greater will. But then we see them. Giant, hairy, literal fingers, twitching almost imperceptibly as an old woman beckons us to enter the room and hear their wisdom.
What if these aren't hairs? What if they're threaded? I'm not being entirely serious, but it is just kind of a random thought.
The standard dismissive line among my friends at the time, whenever we encountered something sufficiently creepy and strange in the game, was, well, George R.R. Martin must have written that part. But the image of the fingers stuck in my head as I continued playing. There was a feeling of inscrutable intent behind them. These things were too deliberate, too uncannily alien, yet familiar to just be a surreal image. And as I continued playing, I became convinced that Elden Ring had a real, meaningful storyline hidden inside of it, which meant there was a reason why the envoys of the Greater Will were fingers. There was a reason why the glimmering golden resources I used to level up were called runes. And there was a reason why Queen Marika had been chosen to become a god, and yet had shattered the Elden Ring and fractured reality. I knew that there was a real artistic vision behind the game, but I couldn't see what it was. Now I can. I can see how the most important aspects of Elden Ring's world can weave together to form a greater whole. So I'm going to do something unorthodox. Rather than a lore video that narrows in on a specific topic, I'm going to zoom out and connect the major threads of lore to craft a complete interpretation of one of the most enigmatic storylines in gaming history.
Good luck.
Come with me, and let's discuss.
Oh no. G-U-T. Guts. This is Berserk.
But first, some preamble. Despite the bombastic title, my goal is not to arrive at the unassailable truth of Elden Ring, but
Okay, that's a little bit alleviating.
to find connections that will allow us, with moderate speculation, to pull together a deeper understanding of the lore. If you're new to Elden Ring lore, I strongly recommend creators like VatiVidya and Smotown that carefully and deliberately go through what we know as a player community. Instead, I'm going to take all these established data points as a basis upon which to build an interpretation. Needless to say, that means extensive spoilers for Elden Ring, but I suspect you knew that. If it feels like I'm going off the deep end at some point, well, maybe I am. but I'm choosing the points to speculate about with purpose. The goal is for each bit of speculation to pay dividends as a tool to enrich our interpretation and allow us to answer questions that often get left unanswered. So let's begin with a question I asked myself in the first few minutes of the game. What are runes?
Chapter 1. What are runes?
As you play Elden Ring, you collect runes from every enemy you defeat, and once you meet Melina, you can use those runes to level up, increasing your strength or dexterity or intelligence. But this terminology never made sense to me. In our world, runes are essentially letters, fragments of words. How do you turn runes into strength?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was
meaning of these
God.
words
John 1:1.
The Bible is a subject for theologians to debate, but some authors have made them quite literal in the context of their own worlds. In the world of Earthsea, by Ursula K. Le Guin, all of creation is made out of words, and magic is done by learning the true name of a thing. That is, its name in the world-making language. Dragons can speak the language of creation natively in Earthsea, so they can breathe fire simply by opening their mouth and saying the word
And check out these saturation levels, that's rough.
fire. This is also how the dragon speech in Skyrim functions, and the King Killer Chronicles and other fantasy series make use of the idea
Hey guys, when do you think that next book in the King Killer Chronicle is going to come out? Next month?
of true names. It's easy to see why the idea of a world made out of words is so appealing to a fantasy author. Not only is it poetic, but in a sense it's true. Earthsea actually is a world made entirely out of words. There's a meta-narrative harmony in a story like this. So what does this have to do with Elden Ring? Well, the biblical influence on Elden Ring is pretty clear when we look at the image of Marika crucified upon a rune arc. But there's something deeper at work here. I think runes are fragments of the language of creation. They are words. Words that impart upon a body knowledge of how to be alive. Instructions for life. Perhaps the words that bind a soul and body together. For that matter, we do have instructions for life built into our bodies in the real world, in the form of DNA, which is its own kind of language. If this is right, if runes are a kind of primordial, life-giving language, it explains why they can be found in every living thing in the lands between. And it even makes sense that collecting more runes can make it possible to update the rules of your body to become stronger, faster, or smarter.
I don't remember if there's anything in the game that you killed that does not give runes, other than like the Lamentor clones. I know in Bloodborne there was one like priest in the fishing hamlet that didn't give any blood echoes, which is always strange to me, but potentially sensible if it's considered bloodless, but I don't know.
But what kind of language are we talking about? Consider the swirling, almost dance-like script visible in an item like the Cypherpata. This same swirling script is visible within the Elden Ring itself if you view it in sufficiently high resolution. Consider that the messengers of the Greater Will are voiceless fingers.
Kyle asks, are scarabs alive? Presumably. Do they not drop runes? I thought they did.
And the person who seems to understand the Golden Order better than anyone else, the noble Gold Mask, never speaks, but only communicates with subtle motions of his body. The language of creation, it seems, is a form of sign language. It is shape and motion itself. As such, spoken words will only ever be able to approximate the deepest truths of the world, which are expressed through motion, through action. This is a fitting underlying reality for a world set within a video game.
And of course, there are arguments to be made that even the spoken word produces echoes and vibrations through the sound and hitting the air and whatnot. We had that discussion about cymatics the other night, and that might play into things as well here.
For an experience that you can only appreciate by playing it. In fact, this is an allegory quite similar to the fantasy world made of words, because meta-narratively, the world of Elden Ring quite literally was made by the motion of fingers. Thousands of fingers tapping out an impossibly complex pattern onto keyboards and making arcane gestures with computer mice.
You gotta clean that keyboard, bro. I mean, look at all that.
Onto keyboards and making arcane gestures with
Life pro tip, everybody. Instead of using compressed air for like cleaning keyboards, I would recommend buying a what are these called? Like an air blower that's not compressed and doesn't work for leaves, but like a hand vacuum type thing almost.
Computer mice. As players, we also interact with the world of Elden Ring using our fingers. So the idea that people inside this world can only understand the distant, mysterious intentions of outer beings by interpreting the motion of fingers is an uncannily organic metaphor for the actual relationship between us as players and the character we control. We even have characters like Ranni express resentment about her lack of free will as her destiny is controlled by the fingers. There's a lot more I can say about the thematic relevance of the fingers, but I'll save that for later. For now, it suffices to say that like most people, my initial reaction to the two fingers was repulsion, and mild shock at how literal their title was.
Yeah, at first I thought like the two fingers were almost like a reference to how Littlefinger is a character in A Song of Ice and Fire, and he's just a dude essentially. A jerk of a dude, but a dude nonetheless. And then when I saw the two fingers in the round table hold, I was like, well, they got me.
But now, the more I think about it, the more strangely interesting I think this design choice is. This can tell us even more about the world, though. If the language of creation is a kind of sign language, then it implies this is a world in which a shape or emotion that represents some aspect of reality invokes that aspect on a deep level.
And this is something that's kind of bothered me for a while, because if the runes are just shapes, then presumably Ranni wouldn't have needed to steal a fragment of a specific rune to imbue her black knives with a specific right to kill Godwyn and or herself. So there's something else at play here, which is kind of hard to square. Maybe there's like a rune prime and then all the other ones are like hearkening back to it, but then like maybe not. I don't know.
This seems to be intrinsic to the nature of magic in Elden Ring, as all spells show a visual crest or symbol related to the kind of magic invoked when cast.
Actually, the ice spells do not have sigils. Yeah, not all of them have sigils, but I know what he's saying.
In such a world, monumental architecture is also more than just symbolic, as visual symbolism itself has metaphysical significance. This might also explain the significance of eyes as a connection to the divine, because eyes can perceive this golden language when ears cannot. Notably, the most ear-themed character in the game is Gideon, the All-Knowing, and his reliance on word of mouth, on indirectly gathering facts, as symbolized by the ear-shaped ornamentation on his armor, may represent the idea that Gideon, despite knowing many facts, lacks true wisdom. You might be wondering, well, how do you pick up something as abstract as a word and put it in your inventory? And this, I think, is where the concept of gold comes in. We constantly hear about the golden order in the game and the grace of gold, so it's easy to see all this as colorful phrases for the same thing, the current order of the world. But then we get descriptions like the Minor Erdtree incantation, which says it contains the kindness of gold without order. So apparently gold and order are separate things, and the Golden Order is made of their union. I have a long version of this, but the short version is that I think gold is an underlying force of life, and it's capable of manifesting runes as golden runes, as a tangible thing you can pick up, and which can be used to heal or nourish a person.
So I think that line of inquiry is pretty good. Obviously, I'm not entirely sure if gold equals life despite everything that's said in the runes themselves. Just because we have like inorganic life matter, but they also kind of have runes. But I also wouldn't be surprised if gold became infused into life to such a degree that it's hard for the people of the world to even be able to think of a type of existence without gold, or runes. But I don't know, man. Because we also have like the cosmic primeval current type stuff, and we don't know if gold is typically intrinsically part of it, or whether or not the primeval current has any true connection to the greater will, or if it's a counterpart to the greater will. It's really fun to think about.
This golden manifestation is a memory.
So what he asks, doesn't gold come from outer space and was initially red in the primordial form of it? So it's kind of weird because we're told that there was a red tinge to the primordial gold, and then when we get into the DLC, they literally have nothing that's red tinged or red tinted, which is, super fun, but that is at least what the game says. Well, it doesn't say that the gold from space was red, but it could be implied.
Of the language of shape and motion being expressed, like all recorded languages. And there's definitely a thematic connection between gold and memory. Also note that when you pick up golden runes, they're always inside of a body, even if it's a dead body. Somehow, a body being a vessel for runes is important. In any case, we can understand why the golden blessings of the Erd Tree would be so revered by the people of the lands between, if it allows them to.
So Elden Enthusiast says that the Elden Stars is tinged red. It's arguable. I don't think most people would agree that it's any more red than a bunch of other stuff, although I could see why you'd think that. So it does kind of look a little bit more red and golden in this location, but it could partially be the lighting because that's a bit of a darker area. Did I cast another spell with this? No, I didn't. Okay. Compared to like the super bright type stuff of the Elden Beast itself. And let's see if I have Blessing of the Erd Tree. Omen Twin. The only thing that is kind of hard to talk about with the Ancient Erd Tree incantations is that we don't really have many examples of them that aren't healing based. This is from 1.0. Oh, no, this is just me picking up the item. Never mind. I don't think I have footage readily available. Screenshots. It's the staff of the Erd Tree doing the Erd Tree slam. Oh, here we go. Blessing of the Erd Tree. Yeah, so this is a little bit more yellowy. Versus Protection of the Erd Tree, which came later. And then, hold on, let's go back to stars. But see, like, in this lighting, it doesn't look particularly red. Although, unless you want to call, like, these orange streaks a little bit more red tinged. Hey, Platinum Chip, nice to see you again. And then the Mania, I don't think I said hello to you earlier. Chadwick, you think he's making a fatal error by giving too much credit to literal gold? And he's putting too much stock into the actual nature of what runes represent? I'm willing to hear him out even if he does make a quote-unquote fatal error. But at the very least, I don't think he's kind of gone too far off the deep end to say that, like, there's anything completely wrong here yet. And then Virum22, welcome on into the stream. Do I think there's going to be a good amount of environmental lore to extract from Duskblood? I hope so. At the very least, I know Mortis Volt is extremely excited about the inclusion of trains and train stations. So if there's not going to be a lot of environmental train lore, he will riot at the very least. But, I mean, I can't imagine that it would... I think a lot of it really is just contingent on the multiplayer aspect of it, and if it's going to be like a more story-focused game or something more akin to Night Rain. But based off of like that trailer and like the wheel girl with the blood sigil put onto the guy's arm, I imagine that it has to have some kind of story. All right, let's go back into it.
To interact with the language of life itself and use that to heal or strengthen people. In summary, runes are literal words. They are the instructions for life, the rules for a living thing, and golden fragments of this language can be collected after something dies. Okay, so then what are great runes?
These are runes, but bigger. That was supposed to be like an old Greg reference, but I kind of forgot how he phrases it with Bailey's. This is Bailey's, but bigger? A bit bigger? This is Bailey's really close up? Anyway.
Great runes are the primary object of our journey. They are initially described to us as shards of the Elden Ring, and we are told that if we can collect enough of them, we can use them to reforge the Elden Ring and repair the world. The Elden Ring itself is essentially a set of rules for all of reality to follow. So naturally, the great runes that make it up seem to be those various rules and principles, individually. Normal runes are rules for a single living thing. Great runes are the rules for multiple living things. However, the great runes are more than just pieces of a whole. They clearly have power on their own, as the opening cinematic tells us that the great runes granted each of the demigods newfound power that led to a great civil war, the Shattering. We can deduce some of these newfound powers by implication. For example, Radahn appears to be a large person before the Shattering, but when we encounter him, he's absolutely enormous, and his size seems to reflect his connection to the powers of gravity, which he uses to hold back meteors, and to ride his comically undersized horse. Mikola, another...
Hold on here. His horse is perfectly normal size. He's just comically oversized.
Shardbearer.
We will not have that Leonard slandered in the chat.
Is said to have always been a charming person, but his ability to magically charm and compel many people at once is shown to be connected to his great rune, because the charm breaks when his great rune shatters in the DLC. Melania, meanwhile, was said to be afflicted with a scarlet rot from birth, but there aren't really references to her spreading this rot and afflicting others prior to the Shattering War. During her confrontation with Radahn, she blooms, and an entire region of the world is effectively destroyed by the spread of her scarlet rot. If we can attribute these increases in power to their great runes, then it seems these shards of the Elden Ring allow each of the demigods to take some aspect of themselves and impose it on the world around them. A rule for many people. But wielding a great rune seems to be beyond the ability of ordinary people. At the beginning of the game, all of the great runes are in the possession of demigods, the direct offspring of God Queen Marika. Or at least that's what we're told by Aeneas, but there's an exception. Renala, the Carian Queen. She is unrelated to Marika, and nonetheless is introduced as a shard bearer. Renala
Yeah, Weddy says the Great Runes are confusing. They're claimed, and yet it seems like they're connected to those runes. For one, Millennia's Great Rune should have been the most sacred. So it's very strange that we kind of technically get the runes from the demigods themselves, but they are quote-unquote devoid of benediction. So you get a rune, but you don't really have the full power of the rune until you visit their respective two fingers. So just the involvement of the two fingers and the great runes in general is very weird. I would have liked to have known what would have happened to Mikola and Melania Shadowhound Beasts if they ever had any, if they were given those by the fingers or anything like that, but apparently not. I'm also really curious about Marika's quote-unquote two fingers because you don't really see those. Are her two fingers the one in the round table hold? I think that's a pretty common theory. But then why does Malekith's kind of stay dead after you beat him in Fair Missoula and or Caelid? Because Blythe will keep coming back no matter what up until Ronnie's fingers are killed. And then, of course, how come Ronnie's fingers are the only ones that are seemingly alive up until she murks them herself? So, Verum, you think too many people are conflating Duskbringers? That's Final Fantasy XIV, isn't it? The Duskbloods with Night Rain? And you think there's going to be a different gameplay loop because Night Rain doesn't have PvP? I don't know. I'm a little bit worried about the PvP multiplayer nature of Switch 2 games in general after seeing how not great it was with the Switch 1. So, oh boy. Keeping my fingers crossed. Zafe, you think that he's overlooking how Mikola helped Millennia suppress the rats? Is it overlooking that? I don't think so. Probably. I was admittedly a little bit distracted by my dog bark running in her sleep, so I wasn't paying as close attention as I probably should have been.
Renala's rune, however, isn't held within her body, but within an amber egg that was given to her by Radagon.
Oh man, and this has just been the topic of so much contention in and of itself. Because technically the egg is the rune, but the rune is in the egg that we take, but the egg is still there. But do we have the egg? Is this a copy of the egg? What is going on here?
And this vessel...
All I can say is that eggs is too damn expensive.
May itself be a yet unborn demigod, for it bears the great rune of the unborn. What's more, it seems Renala can't use this rune properly, because although it is said to perfect those reborn, all of the scholars that Renala uses it on come out wrong.
I do have a point about that, but I was going to make a little bit of a post about how if I do play Saga Frontier 2 next on stream, we will meet another egg in the near future, perhaps. So, as far as the perfect rune of the unborn is concerned, it might only perfect those in possession of the egg, and one could make the argument that the juvenile scholars don't possess the rune and therefore do not come out perfected. But, that's just a little bit of a cope, I think, even if it is potentially true. He said Millennia doesn't spread the rot prior to the Shattering War because she didn't have a great rune. Oh, did he say that? Okay, I must have missed that when I was distracted by the dog.
Notably, Renala's rune is also the only one named like this. Every other great rune is named after the demigod that claimed it.
And of course, Renala's rune is got that whole mystique about it because it shouldn't have been given to her after the Shattering, because it was allegedly a gift from Radagon to her, and then the question becomes, just when the hell did he give it to her? Did he give it to her after the Shattering? Is that why she's still so brokenhearted? I don't know, man. That last one was not like a serious statement, by the way.
Such as Morgoth's rune or Godric's rune. So I think this exception with Renala proves the rule, that the ability to act as the vessel of a great rune is directly connected to one's status as a demigod, categorically distinct from an ordinary person. In turn,
I think, isn't it when you defeat Godfroy, it doesn't say demigod felled, it just says great enemy defeated? I think we saw that on another video, and it made me think about Crunchy's video saying that like Godfroy is the Elden Lord. That's not what he says, but it's funnier to say it that way.
The ability to bear the combined Elden Ring is what would make one a god. But wait, you might say, what about the other obvious exception? The player character, the Tarnished. How is it that we can slay demigods and claim their great runes for ourselves? The short answer is that we can't. At least not on our own. The game draws our attention to the fact that we begin maidenless, and implies that without a finger maiden to assist us on our quest is hopeless. Because of this,
I really do wish that there was a way to play through the game without having to interact with Melina that doesn't rely on just out-and-out glitches or things of that nature. Because it really sucks that you can't get into Leyndell properly unless you talk to her.
we can't even make use of ordinary runes to level up until we meet Melina. Melina is a character ultimately implied to be a demigod herself, a child of Marika, and our ability to interact with runes depends on her. In order to use a great rune, we must do even more. We must take each great rune to the top of a divine tower and commune with a pair of fingers to restore its blessing. And then we need to sacrifice a rune arc each time we wish to invoke the blessing of that great rune. Even then, the rune doesn't truly become ours. In your inventory, it'll still be clearly labeled Morgoth's Rune. And the blessing we get is a pale imitation of the power they were able to invoke from it. In short, we can only indirectly and temporarily tap into the power of a great rune, whereas demigods can attune to them and truly claim them as their own. Perhaps this isn't surprising, though. Ordinary runes are the rule set for a single living being, but a great rune forms a rule that can apply to many people, so it's too great for a single person to bear. Unless they're a demigod. But then, what makes Marika and her offspring so special? Why are they gods and demigods? Let's put the question another way. If an ordinary person cannot hold a great rune within them, what kind of being can? The bizarre answer is a being that is more than one person. One of the biggest reveals of Elden Ring's story is that Marika, the god of this world, and Radagon, the current Elden Lord, are the same person.
Hilko says the reason why the demigods are so damn strong is because they learned how to read.
And this seems to be more than a case of an alternate identity or a split personality, but two distinct people inhabiting the same body. The significance of this is difficult to make sense of, and it's easy to dismiss as just part of the surreal storytelling of From Software. But I think this feature of Marika is...
Oh no, I just thought of another Marika equals Glowmide Queen connection, and Zafe will love it, everybody else who hates the theory is going to hate it. And this will be like the whole Pepe Sylvia type lore theorizing, so strap yourselves in. Dark Souls 1, Dusk. She can use Chameleon to change herself into different things, and she enjoys doing mischief. Elden Ring, Marika, uses Marika's mischief to chameleon herself and turn herself into different things. Dusk equals Marika? Marika equals Dusk-Eyed Queen? Got him.
Isn't a quirk, but a fundamental part of what it means for her to be a god of the lands between. She is more than a person. She is a more complete being because she can hold contradictory aspects within herself. In other words, she's an alchemical rebus.
Oh no, Chadwick, did you watch this already? You said rebus incoming. I was like, nah, surely not. Bro, why does it always show up?
One of the clear influences for Elden Ring is Hermetic alchemy. While pop culture tends to treat alchemy as a magical practice, the historical tradition of alchemy was a precursor to modern chemistry, and some notable alchemists, like Paracelsus, were early advocates for empiricism, encouraging readers to observe the natural world to better understand it. That said, there was definitely a current of mysticism underlying the thinking of most alchemists, and their conclusions will seem dubious to modern eyes. Still, if we look at the work of real-world alchemists, we'll find some of the inspiration for Elden Ring. First, consider the rebus. Wikipedia's summary is a sufficient starting point for us. The rebus is the end product of the alchemical magnum opus, or great work. After one has gone through the stages of putrefaction and purification, separating opposing qualities, those qualities are united once more in what is sometimes described as the divine hermaphrodite, a reconciliation of spirit and matter, a being of both male and female qualities, as indicated by the male and female head within a single body. The rebus is sometimes treated as a synonym for the Philosopher's Stone, and other sources consider it a necessary step in the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Either way, it's one of the greatest accomplishments an alchemist can achieve. Sources will also go on to clarify that the rebus is an allegorical image, a representation of the abstract concept of unifying opposites. I believe that the creators of Elden Ring, however, imagined a world in which this concept was quite literal. The union of opposing elements, such as male and female, growth and rot, body and spirit, or the sun and the moon, is a recurring theme in Elden Ring. In particular, the fact that Radagon and Marika are the male and female halves of the same unified entity connects them to this great work of alchemy. Next, I want to consider sections of the Ripley Scroll, another attempt to describe allegorically how one could create a Philosopher's Stone. Interpreting the allegorical aspects of this scroll is a task for a specialist, but for our purposes, just consider the actual imagery presented. We see the essence of a thing, its blood, spread throughout the world. We see a great tower, at the top of which disparate elements of sun and moon, spirit and body, are being merged. We see people being mutilated and placed into jars, while old men watch expectantly for a divine creature to emerge. Again, these images have a coded meaning of their own, but if you've played the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, you may already start to see the parallels. If Marika is a rebus, a union of opposites, then the Elden Ring is the Philosopher's Stone in this analogy, a stone which is said to be able to bring about eternal life and miraculous transformations. It's easy to...
I don't really mind this idea so much. It just doesn't make a ton of sense to me because presumably before Marika and Radagon united, she already had the Elden Ring and the gold. So maybe she's expecting to perfect the gold even further with the union. But I feel like a lot of people don't want to touch on the potential consequences of Marika's union with Radagon and how that may impact Order in general. Because a lot of people believe that Destined Death was removed towards the beginning of her reign, whereas like perfecting the Order would come later than that moment. So, yeah.
To go too far with this comparison, but the point I'm trying to make is that imagery and abstract concepts from Hermetic alchemy have informed the story of Elden Ring, and by imagining Queen Marika as a rebus, as the endpoint of a long process, we can see that this is not a god that was born, but made.
Chapter 4,
With
The
these
Great
concepts
Tree.
in mind, we're almost ready to tell a story. The last thing we need to consider is the Elden Ring itself. We know that it is made up of great runes, forged together into a combined set of principles for all life, or at least all life that is bound to it by grace. As to its form, we know what the Elden Ring looks like, for despite its abstract nature, it has a physical representation, which we find visibly housed within Marika's body at the end of the game. We also know that the Elden Ring existed in the distant past, in the time when the Elden Lord was an ancient dragon named Placidusax. Between that prehistoric age and the time of the Golden Order, where was the Elden Ring? I think that it remained for unimaginable ages within the great golden tree that grew from the energy of the Crucible. The crucible is said to be a primordial, vital energy from which life emerged, and the crucible is credited with evolutionary gifts, or mutations, that randomly appear among the living creatures of the lands between. We know that a great tree grew from the crucible's energy, the predecessor of the Erd tree, and I believe this tree was the vessel of the Elden Ring for eons. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that a tree was the natural form to emerge when the Elden Ring laid unclaimed for so long.
I know some people, I think Byron, maybe he changed his mind about this on the Discord, believe that the Erd tree could be the byproduct of what happens if you kill a previous god. Because just like how the player dies and produces rune sprouts from their death, what would happen if a god died? Maybe it becomes a big rune sprout, aka an Erd tree, but I don't know. So Pilgrim Butterfly, nice to see you. America had gold before. Since when do you think? Gold being the essence of the crucible, right? So there are a couple epochs to consider with this. I will pull up our trusty dusty paint program. It's not actually dusty, but okay. Let's do a crappy looking dragon. This is a dragon. Oh, it's got to have extra legs because it's an ancient dragon. And then that means extra wings. All right, so anyway, put way too much effort to make this goofy looking dragon butterfly thing. And then, whoop. We'll say like orange for America plus Godfrey. How do I want to... Let's just do an orange tree for the sake of simplicity. Whoop. And then a yellowy tree, perhaps. So... G... R... And then the question becomes, when does the rune of destined death get removed from order and whatnot? Anyway, if you think it happens between Godfrey and America becoming the Lord, so that means America would have had gold at the very beginning of her reign. I mean, she'd still have gold at that point, but then that gold would exist before any so-called unions with Radagon, unless you want to say that she had Radagon with the fire giants and whatnot, but then were they truly unionized at that point? Or unified? I don't know. So there's a lot of room to work with a bunch of this stuff here. Hey Stella, nice to see you, and happy little trees, exactly. Please don't draw anymore? No you. Gold is just the skin over something that was already there? Maybe. I would be curious to see what a non-Elden Ring inclusive lands between would have looked like. Anyway. Oops. That's not what I meant to do. I could do this. Now it's too big on the screen. Okay.
Consider that when we die and drop our runes on the ground, a small spectral tree begins to emerge before we pick those runes back up. Notably, many trees in the real world are also hermaphroditic. They are both male and female. So, like Marika, a tree can naturally represent a union of opposites. In fact, if you look at the shadow tree from a specific angle in the realm of shadow, you can see that it has two bases.
Look at this nerd calling it a shadow tree instead of a skidoo tree.
And the trunks twist together in a spiral shape. This tree is likely the remnants of the Crucible tree, now veiled in shadow, and its role as the predecessor of the Erd tree is why it's explicitly called the shadow of the Erd tree.
And as far as readings go, I think that's probably a fair one to make, but of course, nothing about that is explicit. I do appreciate the tempered use of language there, like using words such as likely to describe the way that he sees things here. So stuff like that is an easy way to avoid me getting triggered about semantics and stuff like this.
The fact that it is a tree made of two twisting trunks could represent the male and female aspects of this tree combining, making it a complete form of life that can serve as a vessel for the Elden Ring.
So some other things to point out with this that might challenge the theory, but they don't necessarily outright contradict it, is that the damn DLC trailer had let us tell us that Marika doing her thing is when both Gold and Shadow were born. And so if you want to say that this is a crucible tree to begin with, aka the Great Tree and whatnot, that's fine. But then do you think that's because the tree shifted into something else? And then how does that coincide with the creation of Shadow as well as Gold is something to consider. Then, of course, you could also just throw out the entirety of Letta's testimony there, because presumably Gold should have existed before Marika's grand event there. So, yeah. Mel asks, the Shadow Tree is supposed to be where the concepts that bears no concept of order, correct? I believe the Shadow Tree doesn't bear a concept of order, and I also think the Minor Erd Tree does not as well. And that's what renders its stock weak and brittle. Hold on, let me look it up. The Skadu Tree is the shadow of the Erd Tree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stock, rendering it brittle. Hold on here. Okay, so I was a little bit curious about the Japanese wording of that. Where's my... Because the English here, I was like, wait, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order? Is this saying that the notions bear no sense of order? Or is it saying that the tree? When I looked at the Japanese, it's definitely talking about the tree cannot be called order. But as far as calling the golden tree the shadow tree and saying like the shadow is... I know he didn't quite say it this way, but I inferred it, is that it's like the previous tree, therefore it's like a shadow. That perfectly aligns with how the character for Shadow can work. It can refer to like something that's kind of dead and gone in a way. That's probably not the best way to phrase it, but oh well. It's the shadow of the crucible tree? Maybe. And welcome back in, Mendacious Cat. Elden said, gold is kind without order, but the shadow tree filled with gold is all messed up. Let me think about that. It is the kindness of gold without order. So I don't think so. You might be able to argue that kindness is a certain aspect of gold, not that gold is inherently kind, perhaps. I should probably double check the text on that, to be fair. Can you imagine how hard it is to get a straight answer out of Miyazaki for what restaurant he wants to eat at? They say he wants kaiten sushi. Shadow of the Urchi should have had Shadow Great Runes, but no, they don't like us having fun. I don't know. Yeah, the remnant of something. That's a good way to say it, Zafe. Thank you. I mean, you guys are popping off tonight. They're saying kindness the same way you'd say the kindness of a warm sunbeam. Perhaps, and especially with the Urchi being likened to a warm, gentle sun in the past. I don't think that's a poor comparison at all. Has anyone looked into the botanical phenomena involving the sap of one tree doing stuff to the other, like some kind of parasitic or symbiotic relationship? Somebody in chat's probably not, but somebody out there at some point ever, perhaps. You don't know tree experts yourself. Yeah, I myself am not a botanist and don't really have a lot of contact with them. What he says, in the time where there's only strength, the gold used to being red gold. Is that like the bears? Or is it that connected to how the bears are red? Maybe. It's just very frustrating to me that like none of the hornsent stuff is red coded whatsoever. And you only have like an extremely small amount of red coding in the DLC as well. Right. So let's go back into it.
If you look at the icon on your map with this in mind, it almost starts to look like two lovers embracing. In any case, now we can fast forward to the time of the hornsent, who worshipped the crucible as a chaotic source of primal energy, and who prized the horns that randomly sprouted on those who lived in the shadow of that great tree. Such growths were seen as a touch of the divine, blessings from the holy energy hidden away in their great tree. So imagine spending your whole life worshipping a great golden tree and the life-giving energy within it, and thinking, if only I could be so grossly incandescent. And now we begin our story. Because the scholars of the hornsent culture weren't content to live in the shadow of this divine power. They wanted to become divine. The first attempt of the hornsent to reach divinity was through asceticism, which we see in the tutelary deities and the ritual of the horned warriors. The horned warriors, despite their name, were learning martial skills largely in service of improving their ability to perform a ritual dance, and the greatest among them were selected to become lion dancers. The lion dancers are modeled after a traditional Chinese style of dance, in which two people work together to form a single creature, united by their performance. In Elden Ring, this dance can invoke the forces of nature, but the ultimate goal was greater still. Listen to the recitation heard when you enter the lion dancers' arena for the first time.
O horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered, take root inside the tower sculpted keepers, and perched within, we beg of thee, rise.
The beast from a higher sphere, referred to in this passage, is almost certainly the beast that literally fell from the heavens in a prior age, the Elden beast.
Oof, I don't know about that one, Tim.
The last boss of the game, which is synonymous with the Elden Ring itself. Seeking to have this entity enter and possess the lion dancers is a prayer for ascension, for them to serve as the vessel for the Elden Ring, and therefore become gods. The fact that the lion dancers are, by their nature, two people becoming one through a ritual suggests that the logic of the rebus was already in play. The hornsent.
So I think I would be able to have this theory rest a bit more easily within me if we had any other kind of like finger coding present within hornsent iconography at all. But they seem completely divorced from the fingers, and the lion dancer lion thing doesn't look like the Elden Beast almost at all. So that's another thing which I wouldn't really want to compare it to. Like maybe if this thing just used a sword of some sort in its hand, I would also be a little bit more comfortable with that comparison. But I just feel like the divine beast in this context is completely different from the literal divine beast of the Elden Beast. Although it is kind of interesting to think of the Elden Beast as a divine beast, and I've certainly made that kind of implication in my video on Marika and the Jarsent, and that if the horns are used to call down divinity and spirits, and the shamans are able to put those spirits in their bodies, then what would happen if you had Miko that was so divine that it was able to house like the most divine thing out there, which could potentially relate to how Marika got the Elden Beast, but of course that's really just more of an implication on my part than anything concrete in the game.
Knew they needed a being who was more than one person in order to house the Elden Ring, and the use of a dance in their ritual might suggest an understanding that the language of creation is motion.
And yeah, as Pilgrim Butterfly points out, there are a couple lions within America's regimes. Like we have the horned guardians. What are they called, actually? The lion guardians? I think they're just called lion guardians. I have good footage of them. Like you could see, there's 2 of them in Castle Sol. There's 2 in Fort Jail. Oh no, that's Lion's Claw. I didn't look. Oh, okay, here we go. So they did have horns on them at some point, because you can see that they've been excised. But of course, like, their eyes are a little bit different, and these things kind of almost resemble demi-humans a bit more. And you might be like, demi-humans? What the hell is he talking about? If you ever see the very cursed image of Malekith without hair or armor, he does kind of look like this. Anyway. You thought she was talking about the soul of the lion dancer itself? I think the lion dancer's bodies are supposed to be conduits for an actual raging beast. Because when you wear the helmet or the head covering of the dancing lion, she refers to you as the beast itself rather than like the sculpted keepers. Pilgrim said, shamans host spirits? You thought it was a hornsent thing to attract spirits and the shamans were more physical. So this is kind of based off of the etymology of Miko and even shaman to a degree in English. Their role is to act as mediums or diviners to bridge like the spirit world and the dead to a degree. But moving beyond that, you could actually see that when the shamans were jarred, they took the spirits of the hornsent within them, which is why they got all like the what are they called? The grudge looking thingies, that not like the movie Grudge. The big jarred shamans, like all the faces in them. Anyway. Yeah, possessed. The screaming faces? Yeah, those things. Like that's because the flesh of the shaman is able to accept like the souls of the dead, presumably. And the Grand Am does call you a sculpted keeper? Maybe. Okay. John Claude Grand Am. O sacred beast, I see thy purpose now. Wax wroth to thy heart's content, wild and free. And then, in exchange for this woman's life, release the sculpted keeper from thy rage, I ask thee at last, O sacred beast. Yeah, she calls it the sacred beast. So she thinks that the sacred beast has a hold on the sculpted keepers. I guess I should show this to you guys as well, but it's right there. Are they called sculpted keepers because they're swole? I believe so, essentially. Because they're just called, like, heroes here. Lord heroes, hero lords, whatever you want to call them. You're willing to take her word? She's a nice grandma. Except for all that time, she tried to send ghosts to kill me. She asks, does a sculpted keeper stand before me? Right, but I mean, the sculpted keeper, in my estimation, is kind of like a vessel. It's kind of being puppeted by the beast on the inside. But you are correct that she does call you sculpted keeper above that. Sculpted keeper, are you... Oh, wait. That's only the English. Unless... No. Oh, she does call you sculpted keeper there, at least. Anyway. Yes, they're essentially called like heroes, but it doesn't quite come across the same way as the word hero does in English. Like the term is kind of like hero / warrior, so you're like heroic for being like so strong, essentially. You see nothing to suggest a connection to the Elden Beast? That's kind of where I am. Just spirits possessing bodies. All right. Yes, Mao Yusha.
And yet for all of their strength and reverence, no lion dancers ever truly ascended. But after asceticism failed to result in ascension,
they don't use the Yusha characters, so I mean it's essentially the same. It's like brave person, but yeah.
The hornsent scholars discovered something else. A group of shamans who had a unique ability to commune with spirits and connect to other living things.
How do you like that? Instead of shamans or shaman, we have shaman now.
We find the remains of one shaman who seems to have merged herself with a tree in the shaman village, and we can assume that this ability to physically meld with other living things was an important part of their spiritual practices. The hornsent saw something else, however, a key ingredient for a new crucible. For if the shamans could meld with others, they could be the basis for creating a person who is more than one person, a rebus. The crucible that the hornsent worshipped was said to be a place where all life was once blended together. And in fact, the word crucible itself refers to a container where materials are melted together. The hornsent took this concept and tried to create an artificial crucible in the most literal and horrific way possible, by merging people together inside of great jars. Since shamans have a unique ability to meld with other living things, they were used as the base for each jar while alive, and had countless other bodies, mostly the bodies of criminals, stuffed into the jars with them. In order to encourage the shamans to meld, they were whipped and mutilated beforehand, so that their bodies would try to heal together with the other flesh in the jar. We know all of this.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty decent reading on like the flesh aspect of it. I haven't really heard anybody else point it out that way, at least in a lore video.
This explicitly from the
yeah, it's fine.
DLC. And we know that the jars were supposedly an attempt to raise the interred to sainthood. Many people in the lore community believe that this was just a ritualistic way of redeeming criminals. But
hey, it's me, people.
I think it was an alchemical experiment, a direct attempt to merge the bodies and the runes of people together to create something new. And eventually...
And as far as it being an alchemical experiment, I mean, it probably is to a degree, because obviously like the jars themselves seem to be kind of pseudo alchemical experiments based off of the reagents you put into them to create like bombs of varying sorts and whatnot.
Eventually, after an untold number of attempts, an untold number of atrocities, they succeeded in the great work and formed the Rebus, their very own vessel for great runes. We know there was a time near the end of hornsent society when Marika was accepted and considered important, as there are statues of Marika throughout the Land of Shadow, her arms outstretched, as if offering comfort or a blessing to the people of this land. We also have various sources referring to Marika's betrayal, implying that she was in a position of trust, despite being a lowly shaman. If she was the long-awaited saint, the promise of ascension nearly complete, then she would have been considered a sacred symbol in hornsent culture. Marika was the promise of a greater, holier future for the hornsent, so they prepared to complete the ascension. I say the ascension, rather than her ascension, because we know the hornsent created the Great Spiral Tower and the Gates of Divinity, but I believe they intended someone else to finish the ritual and gain power over the new order.
So, Mal, you think the jars have something to do with the trees in the tower? Because... Hold on, let me try to reread that. You think that the jars were used to help build the tower? Or at least the people in the jars? It is very interesting that at the very bottom of Bellirat, below Bellirat itself, you have the Bellirat jail, which just has a bunch of jarred folk in it. So there probably is some kind of greater connection between the jars and whatnot. I don't remember how many jars we get in near a limb in general, but I think there's definitely something going on thematically between the above and the so below. This is a men problem, but the way he says shaman makes you think of ShamWow. Stella and her man problems.
America was capable of burying great runes, but in order to tap into their power, they needed the same thing we do in game, a rune arc. The rune arc is a shape that completes and empowers a great rune, for reasons that I'll discuss in a future episode. The point for now is that the hornsent intended Marika to serve as the vessel for the Elden Ring, but not necessarily as a god, and certainly not as both god and lord. Indeed, the separate role of god and lord may have been part of the hornsent's plan for the Ascension ritual, allowing Marika to be the source of power, but placing control in the hands of someone else that they could choose. But Marika betrayed the hornsent, and stepping over a field of fresh corpses, she claimed all of the power of that ritual for herself, gathering the accumulated energy of the tower and the gates of divinity and pouring it into herself, becoming both vessel and god of a complete Elden Ring. So began the Golden Order, and so began the purge of the hornsent, whose faith in the Crucible Marika mocked by exterminating them.
All right, so there we have it. This is kind of where I have an issue with following along with this train of thoughts. Not so much that I think there's like anything particularly problematic with the presentation of things, as much as what it doesn't address. So we're told that the Golden Order was created upon the removal, aka the plucking of the rune of destined death from the Elden Ring. And so my question would be, why would Marika's ascension coincide with removing the rune of death? Is that kind of what he interprets to be what we see in that opening cinematic trailer? I guess it's not technically an opening trailer, but that is certainly one of the impressions that I had when I first saw that trailer, but I didn't really think it worked because I don't think the rune arc thing that she holds up looks like the rune of death or anything, but of course there might be some other rune of death related things that happen off screen for all we know. So it's also quite vexing that we don't know when that scene took place and when the union would have happened, because actually, yeah, wouldn't that be another thing that he needs to think of? I think you mentioned the Rebus scan right there. Let me back it up a little bit.
Power of that ritual for herself, gathering the accumulated energy of the tower and the gates of divinity and pouring it into herself, becoming both vessel and god of a complete Elden Ring.
So he didn't mention the Rebus here, so presumably the Radagon stuff might happen later in his estimation. I honestly don't know. I don't want to accidentally put words in his mouth, but I'm probably going to end up doing it regardless. So maybe this is just part of a long process to create the Rebus in his estimation. I don't know. You think there's at least 2 to 3 wars passed between Marika becoming god and the Crusade of Mesmer? I mean, I think that's a pretty fair read of things, depending on how one feels about the Fire Giants, plus Godfrey's conquest all the way down into the Weeping Peninsula, plus the Liurnian conquest, at the very least 2, potentially 3, or even more that we don't hear of, because the Stormlord could be a separate conquest. We don't know.
So began the Golden Order. And so began the purge of the hornsent, whose faith in the crucible Marika mocked, by exterminating them using enormous furnace golems.
Hold on, did he just equate those? Or is there enough of a time gap with the way he phrased it? Come on, YouTubes.
And so began the purge of the hornsent, whose faith in the crucible Marika mocked, by exterminating them using enormous furnace golems.
And so began the purge. So he might be implying that the Golden Order was created a little bit later in this timeline here, like with the Crucible time, which would be after the Liurnian Wars.
The hornsent had tormented Marika's people, and Marika chose to perpetuate violence instead of ending it. The golden age that followed was supposed to be eternal and perfect, but it was built upon suffering. And that suffering was forged into the very foundation of the world to come. So, what have we learned about Elden Ring? It is a story about the nature of creation and destruction. It is a story about cycles of violence. And it is a story about trying to understand something so distant.
It's tragic when you make your points and then you just got like the background sounds to mess with the audio. Like, it really doesn't matter at all, but it's just something that I hyperfixate on now, having had the experience of doing multiple takes trying to get things right and things in the background to stay silent.
You can only catch glimpses of it. Despite its fantastical and often surreal setting, it is about universal truths. There is much more to say, but I began with these concepts because I see them as foundational to everything else in our understanding of Elden Ring. Thinking of runes as fragments of a world-making language will give us a rich groundwork for understanding sacred geometries, and geometry is deeply important in a world where the language of creation is shape and motion. Meanwhile, the concept of the rebus is a lens for us to dive deeper into the most pervasive theme of Elden Ring, duality. Finally, the idea that the fingers are a medium through which the people of the world attempt to communicate with a distant, unknowable will can lead us to better understand the cosmology of Elden Ring and its core artistic vision. These are each topics I intend to dive into deeper. If you want to hear more about a unified theory of Elden Ring, then like, comment, subscribe, and share with others. This is a new channel, so engagement will dramatically improve the odds that I continue and complete the theory. I want to acknowledge the value of the whole lore community, whose rigorous analysis of the individual items in Elden Ring over the years makes a broader analysis like the one I'm attempting possible. Until next time.
All right, so that's a really good video, especially for a first one. I did notice that the music dropped off at the end. I wonder if they forgot or ran out of time, or if they made the artistic choice to have it remain silent to kind of drive more attention to the conclusion that he was making there. But nonetheless, there really wasn't anything egregious about this at all as far as like the grand unified theories go. It's obviously not entirely wrapped up, and at the very least I can see the rationale that he's building up for himself to kind of make this broader point in general, which is something I can appreciate, even if I have disputes about the details sometimes. But that's just kind of natural as two people looking at a number and trying to decipher if it means 6 or 9, depending on their position. So without horns, welcome back in. How you doing tonight? So, okay, yeah, that was pretty good. So let's go ahead and dive into the next one, part number 2. So how many does he have on his channel right now? Like 12? Not 12 at all. 3. Okay, that's not too bad. So we're not going to get to the third one tonight. Maybe I'll look at that one tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and subscribe, and I've shared the link to the video into the chat with you guys if you want to give Silent Ellipsis here some support. So let's go ahead and move into Sacred Geometry.
what does this symbol mean? This is the first image we see when we load up the game, but many players won't even realize when they begin that this is the Elden Ring itself. After all, it's not actually a ring. It's the loading symbol in the corner of the screen. It's the cover art. It's inside Marika's body at the end of the game. But after completing the entire game, I still didn't know how to interpret it. Yet, there is a reason that the Elden Ring has this particular shape. And by the end of this video, you will find it impossible to unsee. So, once again, come with me, and let's
I'll never be able to unsee the Elden Ring. Oh no.
discuss. It might seem like a fool's errand for me to start with an action-packed game of the year, and end with a video about geometry, of all things. However, Elden Ring has an entire hidden language of shape inside of it, with particular shapes recurring too often to be a coincidence. There's the ring, the spiral, the arc, and others. If we can decipher this language, we will find a treasure trove of connections to make. And yet, no one seems to have cracked the code yet, so let's be the ones to give it an honest try. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to draw from many different examples as I discuss shapes. So if it starts to feel like I'm jerry-rigging an interpretation from disparate parts, keep in mind that the creative process for the game likely worked the other way around. I claimed in my last video that in Elden Ring, the language of creation is shape and motion, and I think the creative team behind the game was working with this concept in mind. So they considered first the intrinsic character of shapes, the story that those individual shapes tell, and then they built a world around those concepts. Before we get to the shapes themselves, however, there are two other fundamental concepts we need to understand.
I declare
Regression
my intent
and causality.
to search the depths of the Golden Order.
At the height of the Golden Order, Marika launched an inquiry into its nature. It seems that even the god of this world didn't fully understand her own order.
And I do think that that is going one step too far, that we don't know whether that was done at the height of the Golden Order or rather at what would become the onset of it.
And so began Golden Order fundamentalism. Now, the word fundamentalism has a very particular and charged association in our world, but in Elden Ring, the word is meant to express a desire to understand the fundamentals of the Golden Order, and this was an intellectual endeavor, as evidenced by the fact that fundamentalist incantations require intelligence to cast. We know what the end point of this inquiry was, because there are two incantations that are labeled as the key fundamentals, namely Law of Regression and Law of Causality. The descriptions of these incantations are extremely confusing, as regression is called the pull of meaning, where causality is said to be the pull between meanings. I think the confusion is intentional, because if you ever tried to read academic theories, they are not famous for being accessible. But let's break down what these spells actually represent. When cast, both spells have you extend and move your arms, almost like the hands of a clock. Whether they are going clockwise or counterclockwise depends on your perspective, but it's still clear that one of the interpretations of these concepts is the forward and backward movement of time. Causality is a chain of cause and effect, the way that one event branches and causes other events as it ripples outward. Regression, on the other hand, is the yearning of things to go back, to reconverge towards the first cause, which is a term in Christian theology to refer to God. This idea that regression turns back time is connected to the spell's effect, which undoes spells and other temporary buffs in the area. However, time is only one axis on which regression and causality act. They are even more fundamental than that. In spatial terms, Causality is about the relationship between things, the idea that even as something divides into many parts, each of those pieces is connected to the others, and so they feel the pull between meanings. Meanwhile, regression is the connection that all of the parts share to their source, the shared pull of one greater meaning. I mentioned that the first cause is a Christian term, but causality is an important concept in many religions, and the Japanese term for law of causality uses the word inga, an important Buddhist concept. I don't want to go too far down the religion rabbit hole, because my goal is to talk about these concepts in relation to Elden Ring. But I'll note that the image that keeps popping into my head whenever I think about inga is a Zen stone garden. I couldn't find a source to back me up on the connection within Zen philosophy itself, but when I look at a stone garden with its ripples...
Alright, so Inga does mean causality, but Inga is also essentially the Japanese Buddhist way of saying karma, which does mean causality. So it's meant in the sense of karma from the Buddhist sense. I'm just kind of repeating myself here. What video do I talk about this in? I know I bring it up. Dang, I don't even remember my own catalog anymore. Anyway, I'll just move on.
Weaving between stones. I always think about the way that the stones are related to each other. The fact that each grain of sand or gravel depends upon the placement of everything else in order to find its spot. So, back to Elden Ring lore. We've gotten very abstract, but this relationship between disparate pieces of a greater whole is also very literal in the background of Elden Ring.
So, building off the concept of causality as it relates to karma is that things are where they are as a byproduct of that which came before, and what you do now will also influence the future. It's essentially like the butterfly effect, and that's why when you're kind of leading a messed up life, a Buddhist can say you're dealing with unresolved karma. Karma doesn't necessarily mean fate. It just kind of means the way of the world is the way that it is because of your actions and your parents' actions and everyone's actions before that. And if you don't deal with your current circumstances, you can't put yourself on a better track. So you saying like deal with unresolved karma isn't saying like, oh, you're fated to be stuck in a situation. It's saying like you need to overcome your current situation to resolve the way that you're living so you could live in a more positive way. Sorry, that's a little bit redundant. Hopefully that makes sense though. And then Pixie, welcome back in. You saw this video a long time ago? Stella says you got to deal with the system, and sometimes it's a system of your own damn making. Just cause and effect applied to everything? Yes. But of course, like, awareness is the number one step to be able to recognize and resolve problems. And then, of course, once you have that awareness, you also need to be aware of your own actions and the consequences of your actions to lead others onto better paths if you're on a good path yourself already. So you can't just chill knowing that you were on the good side of things, because if you allow evil to occur around you, then you're still kind of allowing the proliferation of evil and whatnot, which is bad. And of course, like, evil is a really strong term. It's probably a little bit unfair to use, but just in terms of like simplifying things, I think you guys can get what I mean with that.
We learn from Hyetta that all life was once combined into the one great, which divided itself into many pieces to create life. This narrative is also backed up by Ymir in the DLC.
Oh yeah, Zaif, are you still here? If you are, what do you think of the quote-unquote one great from a Japanese perspective, the Okina Hitotsu? Is that how they refer to it? I don't remember, I'll need to look it up.
Who says that all life began with a great rupture in the sky, which sounds like a description of the Big Bang. The descriptions of the Crucible also describe it as a place where all life was once blended together. So we have multiple different perspectives arriving at a similar fundamental truth about the lore of Elden Ring. Everything was once one, until the greater will chose to divide things and create the many disparate creatures of the world. The first cause is the greater will, and the people of the lands between are the many pieces, existing in relation to each other, the pull between meanings, and yet always feeling a yearning for their origin, for a connection to their creator, the pull of one deeper meaning. This is a big idea to unpack in a few minutes, but let it settle and keep it in the back of your head as we continue to talk about geometry, because it will crop up in discussion of our sacred shapes. Okay, time to actually
Chapter 2, The Ring.
talk about shapes. I'm going to begin with the ring or circle because it's relatively easy to interpret and is arguably the most important symbol of the Golden Order. I say that because of the prominence of rings in the fundamentalist incantations. Among the Golden Order fundamentalists were Radagon and Miquella, the Elden Lord and his demigod child, who crafted spells that reflected their understanding of the Golden Order and offered them to each other as gifts. On the one hand, it's utterly adorable to imagine a father and son engaging in a philosophical debate by crafting spells for each other. On the other hand, we know that the end result of this debate was Miquella abandoning the Golden Order entirely, so what he discovered probably wasn't all that lovely. In any case, the circle is in many ways a simple shape. It often is thought to represent completeness or purity, and in Japanese, it is synonymous with something being true. If you were to give someone a true or false quiz in Japanese, they would answer maru for true, which literally means round, and is represented by drawing a circle. However, the significance of the circle shape in Elden Ring isn't quite as wholesome. The primary symbolic role of the circle is an unbroken boundary. The circle clearly divides what is inside of it from what is outside, dividing what is accepted from what is rejected. Consider the spell called Rejection, which draws a ring of runes around the caster before pushing away all that is without. The spell Law of Causality works in a similar way. The caster implies a circle with the motion of their hands, and once cast, a small circle appears around the caster that retaliates against anything that tries to attack, anything that tries to enter your sacred space. Miquella crafted several incantations that involve rings of light, which move out from the caster and then return, perhaps an expression of the relationship between causality and regression. Radagon responded with his own Ring of Light, a spell that represents the father's understanding of the Golden Order as opposed to the understanding of his gentler son. Radagon's Ring of Light makes a single, great ring which emanates from the caster and strikes everything else. This role of the circle as a division between what is inside and what is out connects to the role of circles in the Elden Ring itself, as most of the great runes have a circular shape, which divides those who are within the bounds of its rule of law and those who are outside of it. Indeed, this division between the in-group and out-group, those with grace and those without, is a major theme in Elden Ring's world. We see that those who live outside of grace are oppressed or forgotten, such as the wandering merchants, the misbegotten, or the Nox.
So about this, I don't know if I would be entirely comfortable with a dichotomy between grace and graceless. And the whole circle thing pertaining to the Elden Ring is fine, I guess. But I'm curious to see if he's going to touch on Radagon's lattice rune behind that and whatnot. Probably not at this point. For what it's worth, the circle is kind of important for like Buddhism, is specifically in Japan, because we have like the Enso, which can represent enlightenment, strength, elegance, the universe, and the void or emptiness, Mu. So yeah, like this kind of represents the universe, nothingness, and everything all at the same time. Because it's like a lot of Japanese stuff was influenced by Taoism, and even like Chinese Buddhism was influenced by Taoism to a degree, which is where I think this ultimately came from. Anyway. The Rune of the Perfect Order is a circle that protects the Elden Ring from the influence of the gods. So yeah, speaking about like circles a bit more, there is the whole inner and outer order aspect of the Golden Order to consider. So it seems like even the things on the outside are still kind of contained within the concept of order to a degree, which sounds a little bit paradoxical or oxymoronical, that which is outside of order is part of order. But I mean, you only have an outside if you've established what's on the inside. So it's, in a way, it's categorized by order, even if it isn't necessarily governed by it. I don't know.
We ourselves are called tarnished, because we are part of a group that were once exiled from the lands between, and have only returned now that grace has been extended to us once more, on a whim. Moreover, the Elden Ring shows a series of circles overlapping, which reflects the tendency of the Golden Order to assimilate disparate groups and graft them onto itself, in what you might call...
And this is also some of the issues that I didn't touch on in the last video, that his characterization of the Elden Ring seems to be primarily focused on the most current instantiation of it, as opposed to incorporating the Fair Mizulan Elden Ring into some of the readings, which is why I'm a little bit more hesitant to be on board with the Grand Unified Theory so far. So even the Fair Mizulan Elden Ring did have circles and stuff, so I don't know how ironclad an argument this is so far.
Alloyed gold. At least, it tends to assimilate groups that are too strong to reject, such as the Carrion Sorcerers or the Ancient Dragons. Those who are both graceless and weak, however, have little recourse but to accept their station as outsiders. Radagon's willingness to embrace this feature of the Golden Order in an unnuanced fashion is expressed in his Ring of Light, for Radagon came to understand the Golden Order and its oppressive character deeply, yet still chose to defend it. Miquella was unable to accept the same truths, and so left to start a new order that could embrace all and bring them into the protection of one great circle, or rather, a circlet. Miquella's circlet says that his new order was to be based upon it, a single, simple, unified ring. This is what Miquella meant by unalloyed gold, not a series of compromises and half-measures, but a single great law that could apply to all. Unfortunately, the single great law he tried to base his order upon was a love that would be compelled by his charm. Miquella's order would indeed have been gentler than the Golden Order, but at the cost of an end to free will.
This is, my favorite thing in the world, pedantry. I don't know about that characterization because apparently Radagon's soul yearned for endless war, which apparently would have been given to him by Miquella. I don't know whether or not Radagon's soul had the right idea about things. He could have been mistaken on that part, but it is just kind of an interesting way that he was characterized in Shadow of the Erdtree with his problematic relationship with Miquella here. And then El Degusto, nice to see you again.
We refuse to be embraced. One more note about rings. I've been using the words ring and circle interchangeably, but there is a reason why the word ring keeps getting used. If we were going to be a little more precise, the ring shape, or annulus, has thickness to it, while a circle does not. But more importantly, when you bring the shape of a circle into three-dimensional space, you would expect its 3D counterpart to be a sphere. But the ring shape we actually see is flat. It exists within a single plane. This will become significant in a minute. In the meantime, that's one shape down so far. Apparently, I can ramble, so buckle up. Maybe get some water, because we've got more to talk about. For contrast to the ring, let us consider the sacred shapes of a culture that predated the Golden Order. The most sacred shapes of the hornsent, which were the spiral and the arc. The spiral is a shape hidden in plain sight in the base game, appearing on armor, in spells, and in the sacred relic sword wielded by the last boss. The DLC has doubled down on this imagery, explaining that it was a sacred symbol of the hornsent, and even telling us in the Spira, or is it Spira, incantation, that it is the shape of a normalized crucible current, whatever that means. Interpreting the shape is hard, because not only is Elden Ring indirect in its storytelling, but the truth of the spiral was clearly hidden away in the realm of shadow.
Do you guys want to know something that might mess up your perception of the world/universe we live in? In a way, technically, the orbiting planets around the sun don't go in a more conventional elliptical design. It's technically a spiral because the sun and the solar system is in constant motion throughout the universe/galaxy. So it's not as though they're ever returning to a point around the sun. It's that they're also like moving along a point as they make those so-called revolutions. So it's all a spiral, baby.
In a recent video, VatiVidya said that the spiral may represent causality, which I thought was interesting because I was thinking of the spiral as representing regression. I see now that it represents both, as I will explain in a moment. But first, let's consider the shape on its own terms. What is a spiral? Well, in 2 dimensions, a spiral is a curve that converges on a point. But that's not actually what most spirals look like in Elden Ring. Elden Ring's spirals are actually 3-dimensional helixes. They are a shape that, unlike a ring, only exists in a 3-dimensional context. In fact, you could say that the relationship between a ring and a spiral is dimensionality. Take the Law of Regression spell, for example. I previously said that the motion of the caster's hands are like the hands of a clock, but that's only if you consider the motion in 2 dimensions. What a Golden Order way of thinking about it, am I right? If you extend the same motion beyond the plane into 3-dimensional space, the motion of your 2 hands, moving around a central axis, becomes a double helix, or a spiral. And this is true of any helix. If you look at a 2-dimensional slice of the motion, it's a ring. But add another dimension and the spiral emerges. If we continue our pattern of interpreting Elden Ring's symbols in very literal fashion, then we might say that the Golden Order attempted to flatten reality by trying to create a perfect and eternal shape for the world. Radagon, in particular, was the staunchest and last standing defender of this order, and his own symbol is a grid shape, which we can see as his desperate attempt to hold the existing order together, to prevent change and maintain the status quo. Now, watch what happens when he dies, in the moment that his gridlock on reality is released. We see the rings of the Elden Ring inside his body, flat circles in a plane with the water. Then, as he passes away, the Elden Beast emerges, and draws out from Radagon's body a spiral. This is a direct representation of the relationship between the ring and the spiral, as new possibilities have been unlocked by Radagon's death, and change can once again come to the lands between, depending on which ending you choose. So, if the spiral is necessarily a shape that exists within movement, that gives us another way of understanding the ring shape, as an unchanging cycle. If we bring Buddhism back off the shelf for a second, there's a very important concept here that connects not only to Elden Ring, but to all of the Souls games. The Wheel of Samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. It is one of the primary goals of a Buddhist, and for the protagonist of every Souls game, to liberate themselves from this endless cycle. In the context of Elden Ring, the Golden Order is built upon an eternal cycle of rebirth, as the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring by Queen Marika. Thus, the dead are buried at the roots of the Erd Tree, for their bodies and souls to be absorbed and reborn in the next generation. By contrast, the Spira incantation says that a spiral-shaped crucible current will one day reach to the heavens to transcend earthly existence. Notably, most of the spiral shapes in the game are specifically double helixes. The double helix is interesting for several reasons. First, as others have noted, it is the shape of DNA in our world. Thus, the fact that we see this shape connected to the Elden Beast and to the Crucible speaks to the role these forces have in the world of Elden Ring as facilitators of transformation, of evolution. The evolutionary gifts of the Crucible are direct analogs to the mutations in our world that get passed to future generations by DNA and natural selection. The other interesting thing about a double helix is that it has two axes of motion for the bodies involved. There is the motion of the two bodies in relation to each other, swirling about each other without ever touching in an eternal dance. This is what we might call the pull between meanings, a representation of causality. Meanwhile, the two bodies together are moving along another axis towards a destination, what you might call a shared pull towards a greater meaning. This is regression. And notably, the Spira incantation
I like the little analogy there, even if I'm still on the fence about it.
in particular, the sacred symbol of the hornsent, moves upward toward the sky, like their great tower, or like the trunks of the shadow tree. If all life originated as part of the one great, in the void between the stars, then this motion is the ultimate expression of regression, of the yearning of all things to return to their origin. So why doesn't a crucible current finish this motion? Why doesn't a tree or a tower reach all the way to the stars? Because in every case, sooner or later, the shape is broken by an arc.
Chapter 4, the Arc.
Is another shape that appears repeatedly in the base game. It is the shape of the item we sacrifice to empower a great rune. It is the shape Marika hangs from within the Erd tree, and in turn, the shape of her own rune, which is found at the very top of the Elden Ring. But before we discuss its symbolic role, let's once again consider the shape on its own terms. Mathematically, an arc is a portion of a circle or curve. By its nature, it is incomplete, part of an implied greater whole. What I find more interesting is that an arc has asymmetry, a kind of directionality. It's hard to find the right language for this because arcs don't really have sides, but I'm going to refer to the inner curve and the outer curve of the arc, and to the direction of the outer curve as the direction that the arc is facing overall, because that's the direction that arc-shaped spells tend to move toward. So with that in mind, the interesting thing about arcs is that they present a very different symbology depending on the direction they're facing. The inner curve implies a gathering of energy and is the shape of open arms welcoming you in. The outer curve implies an emanation of energy or a repulsion, much like being on the outside of a circle. In order to interpret the relevant...
I think that's an interesting idea. I don't think that works entirely based on Litany of Proper Death versus Waves of Gold. And we talked about that yesterday on stream. I might need to talk about that later, depending on how this continues on so far. And then Pixie's saying that he believes that the regression pull of meanings between things stabilizes stuff in the spiral. I get it. I just, I'm still on the fence.
Of arcs in Elden Ring, our first observation is that they are frequently depicted facing down. We see this in the rune arc item in the shape of Marika's arms as depicted in her churches, as well as in the starlight gathering basins and the unnamed tower in the realm of shadow. Some of these objects may seem unrelated at first, but consider the innate character of a downward-facing arc. From above, it looks like a basin, a place where energy from above can gather and coalesce. But from below, it has the character of a great weight looming overhead, or the underside of a celestial body. The game encourages us to consider one of these perspectives first, and then the other. The description of the rune arc item brings the basin metaphor directly to our attention, saying that the lower arc of the Elden Ring is said to be a basin in which blessings gather. These rune arcs are valuable objects that confer blessings upon us. But what about the upper arc in the Elden Ring, where Marika's rune sits? This is the shape of the crucifixes throughout the land between. And when we finally find Marika, she is herself crucified below a rune arc, revealing the other side of the same shape, that the weight of gathered blessings from above must be carried by whoever is below. Indeed, one analog for the shape of Marika's rune is a chalice. A chalice holds water, wine, or even sacred tears. But in this visual analogy, the stem, the weight-bearing part of the object, is where we find Marika herself. Marika is frequently referred to as a vessel for the Elden Ring. And considering my claim from the previous episode that Marika's godhood may be connected to the jarring ritual of the hornsent, there's a clear connection between the image of a container or basin and the shape of the rune arc visible inside her body.
And of course, the Erdtree's favor talisman, hey, he had 59 frames, talks about Marika potentially bestowing them directly onto its recipients in the very beginning of time. Chadwick, you can't be here for any of this? My condolences, bro. You either need to give up and give in to playing Shadow of the Erdtree, or get the spoilers, or just keep burying your head in the sand. It's your own fault, yeah. Sorry, didn't give you any of those spoilerino warnings.
The more oppressive aspect of the arc shape is increasingly brought to our attention the further we get in the game. And in the DLC, we have the arc-shaped spells of the hornsent, which say in their descriptions that the arc resembles the barb, a known symbol of coercive questioning. This is a spell used by inquisitors, so the game wants us to draw a connection between the arc and the enforcement of orthodoxy. The outer curve of the arc emanates force or authority outward in an effort to impose a principle upon those on the receiving end. I said in my last video that great runes contain a rule or a principle for many people, and now we may start to see why we need a rune arc to activate one. You can look at it from either perspective. Blessings gather into the rune arc from above, and when we break it, those blessings pour into ourselves. Or, viewed the other way, we point the outer curve of the rune arc down at ourselves, and as the rule emanates, we become the agent for imposing that rule on the world around us. Either way, the same interpretation on a much grander scale becomes true of Marika, holding an arc shape above her head at the moment of her ascension. We could keep going with all the various arc shapes in the game, applying these visual principles to every arc we see, but I want to get to the even juicier part of this video, which is what happens when these shapes interact.
Chapter 5,
So
the unraveling.
what happens when spirals, arcs, and circles interact? Let's consider the spiral and the arc first. We noted that the spiral has a natural character of movement, and seems connected to evolution and transformation. If the rising spiral in particular refers regressively back to the cosmos as the origin of all life, then the downward arc represents the continued emanation of celestial energy down to the lands between. Moreover, the shape of the arc at the top of a spiral shows the point where regression and causality meet. And let's look at Meteor for the clearest example of what this interaction represents. Meteor's tail, if you can call it that, is a double helix shape, and at the end there are two fingers holding an orb, explicitly called the microcosm. When Meteor casts, these two fingers spread apart and form an arc shape, and the microcosm comes alive, emanating with energy outward in a way that imitates, in miniature, the Big Bang. What I take from this is that the point where causality and regression meet refers to the moment of creation. The spiral unravels into the arc, and this division is synonymous with the act of creation. This connection between division and creation is echoed in the words of Shabriri, avatar of the frenzied flame, who seeks to
So as far as those observations go, I quite appreciate them, even if I'm still a little bit on the fence if that's how they should be read there. I still like it nonetheless.
Do creation. He begs us to destroy all that divides and distinguishes. With this context in mind, let's consider again the relevance of the double helix shape of the crucible as an analog to DNA. The double helix of our DNA contains our genetic memory, but in order to access that memory and create proteins, our DNA also needs to first divide and unravel. This unraveling motion is what gives rise to new life. But we're not done yet, because this lens also gives us a way to dissect much of the plant imagery in the game. Notably, the spiral shape is frequently connected to the crucible tree, which itself has two trunks that twist together. But at the top of a tree, it branches out to form leaves, flowers, and seeds. This painting in the round table hold
I like the script show painting thing right in there.
Directly juxtaposes Marika and the arc shape with the boughs of the Erd tree. And we also see a direct connection between the arc shape and seeds in the seed talismans of the DLC, where a seed can be seen nestled in the arc formed by a pair of fingers. So with seeds and flowers.
You know, thinking about that symbol a little bit more, should this represent a microcosm of some sort? Can a microcosm become a tree? Is that what that represents? I like that idea. I just don't like the timeline of that idea. With the creation of the Erd tree being after the dragons and whatnot.
Formed by a pair of fingers. So with seeds and flowers, spirals and arcs in mind, let's watch one of the most famous cutscenes from the game. Melania's second phase. Melania has been holding back the scarlet rot within her for her entire life, and this is the moment she finally embraces it. A great flower twists together in a spiral shape. This is the shape of transformative energy.
So I would disagree with her holding back the scarlet rot. Well, he says this is the moment, so that does sound a little bit more specific. So I'd say there's two times where she gives in. The first is when she fights for Dawn. That's why she abandons her pride to meet him on equal footing, and she'll embrace the rot to defeat him. And then, of course, here as well.
And here it forms a chrysalis for her to change within. When the flower blooms, it unravels in an act of creation and deification. The arcs implied by this blossomed flower are the emanation of her divine aspect, the spread of her scarlet rot. To reinforce the connection of her spiral-shaped flower with metamorphosis, she emerges with wings and surrounded by butterflies. This cinematic has it all. Also note that this connection between the spiral and the unopened bud appears in the Church of the Bud, in the realm of...
Well, I do like how confident and assured he sounds of this. I'd also like to see him tie this into Miquella's resurgence, which I have a feeling he might not do, so I don't know how fair this comparison is right now.
...of Shadow, and may help to connect this church to the faith of the hornsent.
Or I guess like even Ronnie in a way, although she has her moon, but I digress.
The church is specifically dedicated to buds, to flowers that have yet to blossom. And we get hints that the people of this church may have had a different relationship to rot than we see in Melania and Caelid. Perhaps the ritual of this church respected the spiral form and the transformative aspect of the bud but sought to keep the divine energy of rot under control, to prevent it from blossoming and spreading wildly.
Oh no, does he think Ramana created the Scarlet Rot? So technically, the Church of the Bud should be referring to something before Scarlet Rot was even in here, and then Ramana later turned to the Scarlet Rot in the hope that the bud would bloom once again. So I guess that implies that the bud bloomed at some point in the past, or like figuratively did. Anyway.
Perhaps the ritual of this church respected the spiral form and the transformative aspect of the bud, but sought to keep the divine energy of rot under control, to prevent it from blossoming and spreading wildly. I'll discuss this more in a later episode, but the fact that Melania's bud is spiral-shaped at least helps to draw a connection for a church that otherwise seems misplaced. I mentioned that the seed talismans depict fingers in an arc shape, and that the end of Metzer's tail, we find 2 fingers that open in an arc, and this gives us a hint about the nature of the 2 fingers. Why are they specifically 2 fingers? Well, it's because what they represent within this world is creation through division, through separation.
It's also interesting now that I think about it that the 2 fingers don't like curl toward each other. They kind of curl outward to something else, as opposed to the 2 fingers wrapped around each other with like Metter's tail, I guess.
They are agents of causality. We see in the Round Table Hold that when they are supposedly consulting the greater will, when their attention leaves and they are least active, the least present, their position is closed. Meanwhile, atop the divine towers, pairs of fingers appear dead or catatonic, and yet their position is partially open, and they are still able to function and impart a blessing simply by virtue of their shape. By contrast, the 3 fingers don't form any clear visual shape, because they communicate instead through touch. The 3rd finger is an opposable thumb, which allows them to grasp at the world. The 3 fingers are the most extreme, the most radical agents of regression in the game. So communing by actually reaching out and grabbing us is a fitting metaphor for removing the space between individuals, of undoing what divides and distinguishes. So I'd love to keep rambling about these shape interactions, but I do want to deliver on my promise from the beginning of this video to apply all of this to the Elden Ring. We've already discussed several of its aspects as we've gone along. Noticeably, the modern Elden Ring lacks any form of spiral shape, even though the spiral appears in the more ancient Elden Ring during the Age of Dragons. This tells us that transformative power is suppressed within the Golden Order, which makes sense because the Golden Order is an attempt to create a perfect and eternal, unchanging state for the world. We see that the upper and lower arc point in the same direction, down, and this is the direction in which Marika's divine energy pushes, toward the earth, keeping all living things grounded, literally trapped in the lands between. By contrast, consider that the Rune of Death is one of the rare examples of an upward-facing arc, drawing energy from the earthly realm and sending it up, one way of moving on from the world. We can also see that the overlapping...
I don't know about that. Isn't that just kind of a matter of orientation? Hold on, let me pull up my Rune of Death thing. It's moving up? Oh, does he mean like this way is up? Okay, I can see why he would say that. Guess it really just depends on where the Rune of Death was integrated, or if it was broken in half and is like missing a full circle, which I think is a possibility. Anyway.
Circles in the center of the Elden Ring form what I earlier called alloyed gold, a mix of disparate ideas and people linked together and brought within grace. it also represents the set of laws that the Golden Order enforces on the world, which are in between the arc at the top, which represents Marika, the Godhead, and the arc at the bottom, which represents the emanation of her divine will outward to the lands between. In fact, if you look closely, there are more arcs within the Elden Ring's form, gradually growing as they emanate downward. But there is something else interesting that the game implies to us about the shape of the Elden Ring. Consider the Golden Order Greatsword. This sword belonged to Radagon, who took a gift from his wife and altered it to mirror the shape of the Elden Ring. Or at least, how Radagon sees the Elden Ring. We can see Marika's rune at the top, the handle and pommel of the sword. Then it connects directly to a ring, which is a principle to be enforced by the Order, and it ends in a blade. This item implies to us that, to Radagon's perspective, the shape of the Elden Ring is the shape of a sword. The DLC shows us an even clearer connection between the Elden Ring and a weapon. In order to find it, we have to go down, and then even further down, to the lowest area on the map, the Abyssal Woods. Here we find Midra's manse, and within Midra himself, who is impaled upon a weapon of suppression and torment, placed there by the hornsent inquisitors to punish him for investigating the Flame of Frenzy. The game shows us this shot of Midra, with the golden barbs of a blade spreading out inside his body. We were told that golden arcs resemble barbs, and now we see just what was meant by that. The arcs spreading out within Midra's body amount to an extreme form of torture. But then there's this curious line in the description of this weapon's weapon art. It says that there's something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux. I couldn't quite make out what this meant until the next time I saw Marika, kneeling in a similar position at the end of the game, with the golden arcs of the Elden Ring visibly spreading out within her body. I think the game wants us to compare Midra to Marika, to see the golden arcs of the Elden Ring within her as a representation of torment. Perhaps this shouldn't surprise us, as we already know that her own rune at the top of the Elden Ring is a depiction of her crucifixion.
I think that's probably a pretty fair reading of things there.
With this context, there is at least one thing we can say for certain. Marika's godhood is directly tied to her trauma, just as Midra's rise as the Lord of Frenzied Flame is brought about directly by his own suffering. This is what is meant by saying that suffering is built into the very foundation of the Golden Order. It is woven into the shape of the Elden Ring itself. Before all this, I might have said that the Elden Ring looks like a cascading waterfall of blessings, with the gold in each basin overflowing and pouring down to the next. But now that we have discussed it, I can only see the Elden Ring as an expression of Marika's own suffering, magnified and imposed upon the world around her, the world below her. It is Marika's inability to transcend and escape her own human frailty that traps the rest of the world. And the only people more pitiable than Marika herself are those outside of grace, underneath the hovering blade of the Golden Order.
That's cute. I just wish it mapped a little bit better onto the pre-American, or at the least pre-Godfrey Elden Ring. Postlude.
Well, you all did it. You convinced me to make more Elden Ring content. Honestly, I wasn't sure what the reaction to my first video would be like, and I was blown away, not just by the engagement, but by the words of support and of constructive feedback that came pouring in. I genuinely couldn't ask for a better community to be part of. While we're here, I wanted to bring up something from comments that may serve as an opportunity to clarify how I'm thinking about my project. Several people mentioned Nameless Singer's video about the Erd Tree being a tree of memories, and I actually watched that video myself shortly after finishing recording the bulk of my first video. Nameless Singer focuses on the importance of memory and claims that runes are memories, whereas I say that runes are words. The thing is, these two views aren't actually contradictory.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially when he opened up by saying like the word was flesh and God is the word and all that stuff. So that's just splitting hairs, I think.
I also describe golden runes as a memory, specifically a memory of the expression of the language of creation. I don't think this is exactly what Nameless Singer means by memory, but the point is that these interpretations run parallel to each other, rather than being at odds. I think of our respective interpretations as lenses through which to view the lore, and depending on which pair of interpretive glasses you are wearing, you will notice different connections. It's a question of emphasis. That said, there are a few specific things I'm planning to address in my next video that may bridge some of the gap between these two parallel interpretations. This is a good moment to reflect on what I mean by an interpretation, and why I see my project as different from many others. While I do want my reading of Elden Ring to be correct, that's not really the part that matters to me. The metric I'm using when evaluating an idea to include in my videos is whether or not it adds something meaningful to my interpretation. If it gives us a conceptual tool or allows us to take away a new theme without contradicting anything in the game, that's a good starting point.
I would agree with that. And that's kind of always been my key focus, is on consistency between like hopefully game mechanics, game text, and extra game existing like dev materials. But yeah.
There are other comments that had good questions or thoughts in them, and I might address some of these comments in shorts or in another format. But I do want to keep my flagship videos focused on progressing the core concepts of my theory. So, sorry to anyone who hasn't gotten a satisfying answer to their question yet, but I am reading comments and thinking about them. It may take me a minute to put out the next episode, but there is definitely more coming, and I am excited about some of the points that I've still yet to make. For now, thanks for watching, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Okay, so at this point, I do have some concerns about the format of the video, and this isn't necessarily a criticism of Silent Ellipsis here, as much as it is I've seen this kind of a thing play out in other formats, and it gets me a little bit worried, but hopefully it's just a little bit of unease and doesn't amount to anything. So I don't entirely know what the grand unified theory is yet. We weren't given any kind of like real thesis statement as to how it's all unified beyond there's now runes, and runes kind of coalesce into sacred forms of geometry. And I guess we do have the third video, which is duality in the shadow, and maybe that'll like unite things at the end there. But I also didn't see a part 4, so if this is going to continue even further on in the future, I'm a little bit worried that the goalposts will keep shifting, and with things not ever being properly defined, the grand unified theory might end up being whatever he wants it to be at the moment. I know Tarnished Archaeologist has a really bad habit of doing stuff like that and not going back and, repostulating his previous work, or retracting things or clarifying things. So there really hasn't been anything too wrong about this yet. I just get a little bit worried when there's mentions of something like bigger on the horizon, but I'm still not really getting a full glimpse of that yet. But it might be there. It might be there. Shots fired. I mean, it's true. That's how I see it. It's no secret that I'm not a fan of the way that TA presents information, despite being a fan of the information he presents, if that makes sense. So, okay, folks, that was the last video that I had on the schedule for tonight. I want to thank you all for joining me, as always. Meow Laser points out that the grand unified theory is the friends we made along the way. Aw, isn't that sweet? So, as always, let's finish this out.
Until next time.
Got him. All right. So I've gone ahead and shared Grand Ellipsis's, no, not Grand Ellipsis, Silent Ellipsis's video in the chat. If you guys want to give them some support, that'll definitely be appreciated. And yeah, that'll be it for tonight. I'm not sure what I want to watch tomorrow. I'll probably go into the third one of this. And then shortly after this, I might start streaming another game, whether that be Kazan or Saga Frontier 2 or something else I will need to figure out. I still kind of want to beat Kazan before I start streaming it. And I'm imagining that I probably have a couple days worth left so far. It's the Grand Ununified Theory. I mean, he might be working up to it. I don't think that like these two videos so far were completely disconnected from each other. I see more connections than not, but I just get a little bit antsy at this point when there's a lot of buildup, but not a ton of like conclusions yet. Is Kazan good? It's actually very, very good. Arguably, it might have better combat than Elden Ring if you're not one to get hung up on the freedom of build options or having a huge variety of choices in the builds. Like there is a lot of choice and variety in the builds, but not quite at the same level as like faith, incantations, intelligence sorceries, strength, unga bunga, and dex stuff. It's a little bit more limited, but there's a lot more depth to what you can do within those limits. I think it's probably the best Souls-like that I've played from a non-FromSoft game or for a non-FromSoft game, and it's arguably even better than some of the FromSoft games from a pure action standpoint. Pigsy, you like the videos, but you think if someone thought they had a big answer to the game, they wouldn't hide the ball. It's not always that easy. Obviously, with my videos, I have to do a lot of preambling to set up the points that I want to make, and sometimes the way that I like to make videos is like leaving things a little bit between the lines for people to pick up on their own. So he might be doing something similar where he feels like he needs to get a lot of context out of the way before he can talk about what he really wants to talk about. So I'm not like that worried based off of like how thoughtful these previous two videos have been so far, but I still can't help but feel a little bit of that unease. So anyway, folks, thanks again for joining. We'll be going live once more at the normal time of 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So hopefully I will catch you on the next one. Until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.